Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been wanting to share this for a while, but it still shakes me up when I think about it. I live on a small farm just outside Chehalis, Washington. It's nothing fancy, just a few acres with a house that creaks more than I'd like during windy nights. The place has always been my own little corner of peace, tucked away from the world. I guess that's why this whole thing rattled me so much. My peaceful little hideaway was anything but peaceful that night. It all started about 6 months ago when I found this dog on my porch. He was this shaggy, pure white dog, big guy, probably some kind of Pyrenees mix, and he looked like he'd been through hell. His fur was matted, and he had that worn-out look like he'd been wandering for ages. Despite all that, he had this happy wag to his tail, and for some reason, I just felt like calling him Happy. Original, I know, but it fit. Happy wasn't like any stray I'd ever seen. He'd show up, hang around the farm, and then disappear into the woods. Sometimes he'd be gone for days, and I'd think he was gone for good, but then I'd find him sitting on the porch again, wagging his tail like he'd never left. There was something about the way he stared into the forest, though, that unsettled me. I used to catch him looking out there, ears perked, like he was listening for something or someone. Then one night, everything changed. I was sitting on the couch, flipping through channels when I heard Happy barking outside. It wasn't his usual bark. This one had a sharpness to it, almost like he was trying to warn me. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. It was late. Maybe 11 p.m. or so, and the forest around my place was pitch black, the kind of darkness that makes your skin prickle. Happy was standing at the edge of the yard, staring into the trees, growling low. I tried to shine my flashlight where he was looking, but all I could see were shadows and leaves rustling in the wind. And then, I swear to God, something moved. I caught a glimpse of it. At first I thought it might be a deer or maybe a bear, but it was taller than anything that should have been out there. It looked wrong. Whatever it was, it stepped closer, and that's when I realized it wasn't just an animal. It was tall, hunched, with long arms that hung down past its knees. Its body was covered in hair, thick, matted hair that reminded me of Happy when I first saw him. It had these eyes, though. Even through the dark, I could see them glinting. It was staring at me, or maybe at Happy, like it was trying to figure us out. I panicked. I ran back inside, grabbed my rifle. I don't even remember thinking. I just acted. Happy wasn't barking anymore. He was whining, almost like he was afraid for me more than himself. When I got back outside, the creature had moved closer, almost to the edge of my lawn. And Happy, he wasn't running away. He wasn't even scared. He was just standing there, looking at it. I didn't know what else to do. I fired a shot into the air, hoping it would scare it off. But instead, the creature let out this noise, this low, guttural sound that made my stomach twist into knots. It wasn't a growl. It was almost like a cry. I fired again, this time aiming at it, and the creature fell backward into the woods out of sight. The silence after that was deafening. Happy took off into the woods after it, and I screamed for him to come back. But he was gone. I stayed up all night, pacing, waiting for Happy to return. But he didn't. When the sun came up, I went into the woods, following the path where I'd seen the creature fall. My hands were shaking the whole time, and I kept telling myself I was crazy, that I'd imagined the whole thing. But then I found it. It was lying on the ground, bleeding. He wasn't dead, just hurt. Up close, it looked even more human. His face was broad, almost like a gorilla, but with eyes that seemed almost kind. He was breathing heavily, and his eyes locked on mine. There was no anger there, just pain, and maybe even fear. Happy was there too, lying beside him, licking his wounds. I can't even explain why, but I felt this wave of guilt hit me so hard it almost knocked me over. I had done this. Whatever this creature was, it wasn't trying to hurt me. It had trusted Happy, and maybe even me, and I had shot it. I couldn't just leave him there. I ran back to the house, grabbed some old blankets and whatever first aid supplies I had, and went back. I wrapped him up as best I could, and I tried to help. Happy stayed beside him the whole time, and I swear it was like Happy knew what to do. He'd nudge me when I was doing something wrong, or whine if I touched a spot that made the creature wince. Over the next few weeks I took care of him. I called him Hose because, well, he looked like a hose to me. I don't know why. It just felt right. Hose never spoke, never made a sound apart from those low, soft cries when he was in pain. He was massive, even injured, but there was something gentle about him. His eyes followed me whenever I moved, like he was trying to understand why I was helping him after what I had done. It wasn't easy. I was terrified half the time, scared that he'd turn on me, or that someone would find out what I was hiding in my barn. But Hose never showed any aggression. Happy was always by his side, and the two of them seemed to have some kind of understanding, some bond that I couldn't begin to understand. And then, one day, he was gone. I went out to the barn in the morning, like I always did, with some food and water, but Hos wasn't there. The blankets were folded, yes, folded, as if to say thank you. Happy was sitting there, staring at the empty space where Hos had been, wagging his tail slowly, like he knew this was goodbye. I haven't seen Hos since. Sometimes, late at night, I'll hear something in the woods, branches snapping, that low, familiar rustle, and I'll wonder if he's out there, watching. Happy still disappears sometimes, wandering into the woods like he's meeting an old friend. I don't know if Hose will ever come back, but I hope he's okay. I hope he knows I'm sorry. I still don't know what Hose was. Bigfoot? Some kind of lost creature? I have no idea. But I do know one thing. Whatever he wasn't just an animal. He was something more, something I can't explain. And even now, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching over me and Happy, just like we tried to watch over him. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Honestly, if someone else told me this story, I don't know if I'd believe it either. But it happened. And every time I see Happy staring into the woods, I wonder if someday, maybe, I'll see those eyes staring back at me again. It was supposed to be a simple getaway, just me and Eric, out in the mountains like old times. Eric had been going through some tough stuff lately, relationship falling apart, job uncertainty, that kind of thing. I figured a weekend out in the San Juan Mountains might help clear his head. I mean, it always worked for us in the past. We both love the outdoors, and there's something about being out in the wilderness that just resets your mind, you know? We set up camp in this little clearing we found. The mountains were gorgeous, covered in evergreens, and the air was crisp, the kind of cool that pinches your nose a bit but feels pure. It was perfect. There wasn't anyone else around. It was exactly what Eric needed, some space, some quiet. We made a small fire, had a couple of beers, and talked about the old days. For a few hours, it felt like everything was okay again, just us and the stars above. It was sometime past midnight when things started getting weird. I was half dozing off by the fire while Eric was poking around the campsite, trying to find a good spot to, relieve himself. That's when I saw the lights. At first, I thought maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. Little flickers up near the peak, like someone was shining a flashlight, or maybe there were some campers up there, but the lights weren't steady. They moved in this strange, erratic way, flickering, almost like they were dancing. I called Eric over and pointed them out, and we both stood there staring, not really sure what to make of it. We kept watching, and that's when we noticed the shadows. Not ours, but up there on the mountain. These shapes, big, almost human-like, but way too tall, too lanky. They weren't just shadows of trees or rocks. They moved like they had intent, almost gliding across the ridge. Eric looked at me, and I could see the confusion turn into something else, fear. And I'll be honest, I felt it too. My gut just twisted in this uncomfortable way, like something was wrong, something beyond just weird lights. I told Eric it was probably just some hikers messing around, but he wasn't buying it. We both stood there, eyes glued to the ridge, trying to figure out what the hell we were looking at. The lights would blink on and off, and every time they did, it felt like those shadows shifted a little closer. Eric started pacing around, mumbling that this wasn't right, that we should leave. I told him to chill, that we were fine, but I was starting to doubt it myself. That's when we heard it, this deep, almost guttural noise, like a mix between a growl and a groan. It echoed through the trees, and I swear I felt it in my chest. We both froze. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a bear, but it sounded off, like nothing I'd ever heard before. And then, just beyond the edge of our campfire's light, we saw it. A figure, tall and broad, moving slowly between the trees. It wasn't a bear. It walked on two legs, its silhouette massive, and it moved deliberately, like it was coming right for us. Eric completely lost it. He started panicking, saying we needed to get the hell out of there. I can't blame him. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep my flashlight steady, but I knew running off into the dark wasn't an option. We'd get lost, or worse. So I did the only thing I could think of. I threw more wood onto the fire, trying to make it as big as possible. I had this stupid idea in my head that maybe, just maybe, the fire would keep whatever it was away. Eric was pacing, his breath coming out in ragged gasps, while I kept my eyes locked on the edge of the woods. The figure stopped, just outside the light. I could barely make it out, a hulking shape, almost blending in with the darkness. It just stood there, watching us. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. I was rooted there, staring back at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Eventually it just turned. It moved back into the trees, disappearing as quickly as it had come. The lights up on the ridge were gone too, and the shadows had vanished. It was like everything had just stopped, leaving us there with nothing but the crackling of the fire and our own heavy breathing. We didn't sleep at all that night. We just sat by the fire, jumping at every little noise, waiting for the sun to come up. When morning finally came, we started packing up, both of us too freaked out to stay another minute. That's when this guy came stumbling into our camp. He looked as messed up as we felt, eyes wide, face pale. He said he'd been camping a little ways up the trail and had seen something, creatures he called them, moving through the woods. Said they had followed him, that he had barely made it through the night. Hearing that just cemented it for me. Whatever we saw, it wasn't just in our heads. We didn't waste any time after that. We packed up and got the hell out of there, hiking back to the car as fast as we could without breaking into a full-on run. The whole way down, I kept expecting to hear that growl again, or to see those lights flickering through the trees. But there was nothing. Just the wind and the sound of our footsteps crunching on the trail. I still don't know what we saw up there. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some kind of weird optical illusion, or some pranksters messing with us. But deep down, I don't really believe that. The fear I felt that night, the way those shadows moved, the way that thing just watched us, it felt too real, too deliberate. Eric doesn't like to talk about it. Any time I bring it up, he just shakes his head and changes the subject. I think he's trying to forget, to convince himself it was all just a bad dream. But I can't shake it. Every time I close my eyes, I see those lights, those shadows gliding along the ridge. I hear that low, guttural sound, and I feel that same cold fear creeping up my spine. I've been camping plenty of times since then, but I won't go back to the San Juans. Whatever's up there, I don't want to see it again. And if you're ever thinking about camping out that way, just be careful. There's something in those mountains, something that doesn't want us there, and I have no intention of finding out what it is. I've been thinking about whether or not to share this for a long time. To be honest, I still wake up in a cold sweat some nights, replaying the events over and over again in my head. But I guess there's something about writing it all down that might help me make sense of it, or at least get some of this weight off my chest. So here goes. This is what happened to me, and I'm not sure I'll ever find peace from it. It was a late autumn evening, just before sunset, and I was driving a loaded coal train across the Green River Bridge. I've been an engineer for most of my life, and I always loved the quiet moments during these long runs, the tracks stretching out before you, the way the sky seemed to swallow you whole in the middle of nowhere. But that evening, something just felt off. It's hard to explain, but there was a tension in the air, like I was being watched, even though I was alone in the cab. I chalked it up to exhaustion. It had been a long shift and the weather was turning, but the feeling lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. The Green River Bridge is an old, creaky structure, one of those relics from another era that somehow still manages to do its job. As the train approached the bridge, I eased back a bit on the throttle, trying to take it nice and steady across the span. That's when I saw it. This figure, this massive, hulking shape walking along the tracks up ahead. It was moving slowly, almost like it didn't have a care in the world. At first I thought it might be some idiot who had wandered onto the bridge. Kids or thrill-seekers sometimes mess around out there. But as I got closer, I realized this thing was huge, way too big to be a person. I pulled the horn, long and loud. I hoped, no, I prayed, that it would get out of the way, that I wouldn't have to make that awful decision. I've seen deer, even the occasional cow, get hit by a train before. It's not pretty, but this was different. The closer I got, the clearer it became that whatever this was, it wasn't moving. It just stood there, in the middle of the bridge, staring straight at me. The next few seconds felt like an eternity. My hand was trembling as I tried to apply the brakes, but with a train that size, you can't just stop on a dime. The screeching of the wheels echoed off the bridge and the river below, but it was too late. I felt the sickening thud as the locomotive made contact. The entire train shuddered, and I felt my stomach drop like I'd just gone over a cliff. I shut my eyes, hoping that somehow, some way it would be gone when I opened them. But it wasn't. I saw it, just for a split second, crumpled against the front of the locomotive, its face twisted in a way that still makes my skin crawl to remember. It looked like a person, but not quite. Its limbs were too long, its chest too broad, its face. It had eyes, dark and glassy, staring at me through the windshield. And then it was gone. It tumbled off the bridge, disappearing into the shadows below. I barely remember making it across the bridge. I was in shock, my hands locked on the controls, my brain buzzing with the disbelief of what had just happened. When I finally got to a stop, I radioed it in. My voice was shaky, almost unrecognizable. The dispatcher sent a crew out to investigate, and I had to sit there on the side of the tracks, waiting, the silence pressing in on me. I've never felt more alone in my entire life. The crew arrived, and they spent hours combing the bridge and the area below. But they didn't find anything. No body, no blood, no sign that anything had been there at all. It didn't make any sense. I knew what I'd seen. I knew I'd hit something, but there was nothing. It was like it had just vanished. They tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just an animal, that maybe I'd imagined the human-like features in the stress of the moment. But I knew better. I knew what I'd seen. I tried to move on, to tell myself it was just a freak accident or a trick of the light. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it, something unnatural. Over the next few weeks I started seeing it again. I'd be driving the train on a different stretch of track, miles away from Green River, and I'd catch a glimpse of something in the tree line. A tall, dark figure, always just far enough away that I couldn't make out the details. It would be there one second and gone the next. I started losing sleep, dreading every shift, waiting for the moment when I'd see it again. The worst part was that it always seemed to be looking right at me. I could feel its eyes on me, even when I couldn't see it. Eventually I couldn't take it anymore. I put in for early retirement. The company thought I was just burnt out, that I needed a break after all those years on the rails. I didn't argue. I just wanted to get away, to put as much distance between myself and that bridge as I could. But even after I left, the sightings didn't stop. I'd be driving down a back road near my house, and I'd catch a glimpse of it in the rearview mirror. Always there, always watching. I've talked to a few other railroad guys over the years, and some of them have their own stories about Green River. They've seen things, figures on the tracks, shadows that don't belong. One guy even told me he'd heard footsteps on the roof of his cab while crossing the bridge late one night, but when he stopped to check, there was nothing there. It makes me think that whatever I hit that night, it wasn't just some animal. It was something else, something that's still out there. I don't know if I'll ever get over what happened. I still see its face in my dreams, those dark eyes staring right through me. I've tried to convince myself that it's all in my head, that maybe the stress of the job just finally got to me. But deep down, I know that's not true. I know what I saw, and I think, somehow, it's still out there, waiting. I've learned to live with it, more or less. I don't go near Green River anymore, and I've moved to a different part of the state, far from the tracks. But every once in a while, I'll be out in the woods or driving down some lonely road, and I'll get that feeling again. That sense of being watched, of something just out of sight. And I know it's still there, somewhere, waiting for the right moment to show itself again. I wish I had some kind of explanation, some way to make sense of it all, but I don't. All I know is that, for whatever reason, it chose me. And I've got a feeling that, one day, it'll come back. Maybe it wants something, or maybe it's just curious. I don't know. But until that day comes, all I can do is try to keep moving, try to forget, even though I know I never really will. I want to share something that still haunts me to this day. I'm not really the type to post on forums, but honestly, maybe putting it out here will help me make sense of it, or at least get some of this weight off my chest. So, here goes. This all happened a few years back, and I still can't shake it. At the time, I was trying to get away from my ex-husband. To be blunt, he was a nightmare, and I was tired of looking over my shoulder every day. I decided I needed a break, some time alone to figure myself out. No one around, no one bothering me. Just me and some peace. So I packed up my old Jeep with the basics. Tent, sleeping bag, some canned food, and enough firewood to last a couple of weeks. My destination? The Trinity Alps in Northern California. I'd read it was beautiful up there, and more importantly, it was remote, exactly what I needed. The first week was honestly pretty great. I set up my camp in this small clearing surrounded by pine trees, not far from a creek. It was quiet, aside from the usual sounds of nature, just what I was looking for. I spent my days hiking, reading, and taking in the fresh air. I felt free for the first time in a long time. But that feeling didn't last. It started around the 7th or 8th night. I was just dozing off when I heard it, this faint sound that at first I thought was the wind, but then I realized it was more rhythmic, almost like a soft crying. It sounded distant, like it was coming from deep in the forest. I tried to brush it off. I've camped before, and I know animals can make some strange noises, especially at night. I told myself it was probably just a coyote or some other animal. Still, it was unsettling. The next night the crying came again, but it was closer. It sounded almost human, like a woman or maybe a child. I could feel my skin crawl, and my gut was telling me to leave. But I didn't want to just pack up and run. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just my imagination getting the best of me. I tried to ignore it. But then things got worse. A couple of nights later I was woken up by something else. This wasn't crying. It was a sharp crack, like a branch snapping, followed by the sound of someone, walking just outside my tent. Heavy footsteps, moving slowly, deliberately. My heart was pounding, and I just lay there, frozen, barely breathing. I could hear the footsteps circling my tent, crunching on the pine needles, and then, nothing, just silence. I stayed awake the rest of the night, my ears straining to hear anything. But it was dead quiet, almost unnaturally so. I convinced myself that it could have been a deer, or maybe a bear. I'd been careful with my food, though, keeping it sealed and stored away from camp. It didn't make sense for an animal to just hang around like that, but I had to believe it, because the alternative was too terrifying. The night that finally broke me was about 3 days later. I was asleep, or at least trying to sleep, when I felt it. My entire tent shifted, like something had grabbed hold of it and was dragging it. I shot up, disoriented, my heart hammering in my chest. The tent was moving, being pulled along the ground. I could hear the scraping of the stakes being ripped out of the dirt. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag and unzipped the tent, practically falling out in my panic. That's when I saw them. There were 3, maybe 4 figures, tall and dark, standing just beyond the glow of my dying campfire. They were impossibly tall, and their silhouettes were all wrong, like their limbs were too long for their bodies. They just stood there, not moving, watching me. I don't think I've ever felt fear like that in my entire life. It was this primal terror, like every cell in my body was screaming at me to run. I didn't even bother packing up. I bolted to my Jeep, my bare feet barely feeling the rocks and sticks beneath them. I threw myself inside, locking the doors, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. When the engine finally roared to life, The headlights lit up the clearing, and they were still there. I could see them better now. Their skin was this sickly greyish colour, and their eyes reflected the light like an animal's. They didn't move, just watched as I slammed the Jeep into reverse and tore out of there. I didn't care where I was going, as long as it was away from them. I drove for hours, down those winding mountain roads, not stopping until I hit a small town miles away. I parked in a gas station lot and just sat there, shaking, until the sun came up. I must have looked insane, barefoot, my clothes dirty, my eyes red from crying. But I didn't care. I was alive. I didn't even go back for my gear. I left everything, tent, clothes, supplies, all of it. I didn't want anything that might remind me of that night. Eventually, I made my way to Las Vegas. I needed people around me, noise, lights, anything to make me feel safe. I rented a cheap apartment and got a job as a bartender, just trying to get my life back together. But even now, years later, I can't shake it. I don't go camping anymore. Hell, I don't even like driving through wooded areas. Every time I see a thick patch of trees, I feel that same cold fear creeping up my spine, and I can't help but look, just to make sure there's nothing there watching me. I don't know what I saw that night. I've read about Bigfoot sightings, and maybe that's what some people would call it. But these things, they weren't like anything I'd ever heard of before. They felt wrong, like they didn't belong in this world. I still have nightmares about them, about those long, twisted limbs and those cold, reflective eyes. I'm not sure why I'm even posting this. Maybe I just need someone to tell me I'm not crazy, that I'm not the only one who's seen something like this. Or maybe I just need to get it off my chest, to finally let go of some of the fear that's been eating at me all these years. All I know is, I'll never set foot in those woods again. Not ever. I never thought I'd be sharing this, but I need to get it off my chest. What happened to me last month in Nebraska still keeps me up at night, and honestly, I'm still trying to make sense of it all. I inherited my grandparents' farm near Valentine, Nebraska, about 5 years ago. It's been sitting mostly empty since then, with just occasional maintenance visits from a local guy. After burning out from my marketing job in Chicago, I figured some time alone in the countryside would do me good. You know, that whole return to your roots thing people talk about. Plus, I'd been having these panic attacks at work, and my therapist suggested a change of environment might help. Boy, was that advice going to backfire. I brought my German Shepherd Max with me. He's usually great company and an excellent guard dog, which made me feel safer about staying alone in such an isolated place. The farm itself is pretty typical for Nebraska. Main house, old barn, tool shed, and cornfields stretching as far as you can see. The nearest neighbor is about 2 miles down the road. The first week was peaceful. I'd wake up to birds chirping, spend my mornings doing light maintenance around the house, take walks with Max, and catch up on reading. The corn was about 7 feet tall at that point, creating these massive natural walls around the property. During sunset, the whole field would turn this beautiful golden color. I actually started feeling better, more relaxed. But things changed during the second week. It started with footsteps in the cornfield at night. At first I tried to rationalize it, probably deer or coyotes, right? But these sounds were different, heavy, deliberate, like something big was walking through there. Max would get really agitated, standing at the window facing the field, growling with his hackles raised. He's usually pretty chill around wildlife, so his behavior really unsettled me. One morning, I noticed something odd in the cornfield. About 50 feet from the house, there was this path of broken stalks, like something had walked through there. But here's the weird part. The corn was crushed in a way I'd never seen before. The stalks weren't just bent, they were completely flattened in these massive impressions. I measured one. It was 17 inches long and about 8 inches wide. I'm not some tracking expert, but I grew up around here, and I've never seen anything leave prints like that. I started keeping a baseball bat by my bed and downloaded one of those security camera apps that turns your old phone into a motion detection camera. I set up 3 old phones around the property, one pointing at the back porch, one at the barn entrance, and one facing the cornfield. The footage I got was strange. Most nights nothing, But sometimes, usually between 2 and 4 a.m., the cameras would catch these dark masses moving at the edge of their range. Not clear enough to make out what it was, just this tall, dark shape moving between the corn rows. The night everything went to hell, I was getting ready for bed around 11 p.m. when Max suddenly bolted out the back door. I must have not latched it properly after taking out the trash. He was barking like crazy, running straight for the cornfield. I grabbed my flashlight and ran after him, calling his name. The corn was wet with dew, and my pajama pants were getting soaked as I pushed through the stalks. I followed Max's barking deeper into the field. The rows of corn seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, and my flashlight beam just got swallowed up by the darkness. Then Max's barking suddenly stopped. That silence was worse than any noise I'd ever heard. I called out for him again, sweeping my flashlight around frantically. That's when I saw it. At first it was just a dark shape standing maybe 30 feet away, where my flashlight beam couldn't quite reach. But then it moved, and I realized how tall it was, at least 8 feet, maybe more. It was covered in what looked like dark matted fur, and it was just standing there, watching me. I couldn't make out its face clearly, but I could feel it staring at me. The worst part wasn't how it looked, though. It was the smell, this overwhelming, musky odor, like wet dog mixed with something rotten, and the silence. Everything was completely still, not even cricket sounds. Just my own breathing and this presence. Max came running back to me from a different direction, whimpering. The figure still hadn't moved. I started backing away slowly, pulling Max by his collar. Every survival instinct was screaming at me to run, but I remembered reading somewhere that you shouldn't run from predators. So I kept backing up, one step at a time, until I felt the edge of the cornfield against my back. That's when it made this sound. Not quite a growl, not quite human, more like a deep rumble that I could feel in my chest. I broke into a run then, dragging Max with me. I swear I could hear heavy footsteps behind us, but I didn't look back until I was inside the house with the doors locked. I spent the rest of the night in my bedroom with Max, the baseball bat clutched in my hands. I could hear it moving around outside, heavy footsteps circling the house. Around dawn, everything went quiet. When morning came, I found new tracks all around the house, deep impressions in the mud from the previous night's dew. I took pictures, but they don't really show the scale of them clearly. The corn around the house was damaged too, whole sections pushed down or broken. I packed up and left that afternoon, called my boss and told her I'd be back early. I've only gone back once during daylight to pick up the rest of my stuff. The local maintenance guy still checks on the place, but he hasn't reported anything unusual. I've spent countless hours researching since then, trying to make sense of what I saw. People around Valentine have stories about strange things in the cornfields, but most treat them as local legends. I know what I saw wasn't a bear or any animal I'm familiar with. The footprints, the height, the way it moved, it was something else entirely. I still have nightmares about that figure standing in the corn, that feeling of being watched. Max won't go near cornfields anymore, not even the small decorative ones in the city parks. I've thought about reporting it to someone, but who would believe me? And what would they do anyway? Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, walking through those corn rows at night. I've thought about setting up better cameras, going back with more people. But honestly, I'm too scared. That farm's been in my family for generations, but I'm thinking of selling it. I know this sounds crazy, but whatever's out there, it felt ancient, like it had been there long before us and we were the intruders. I've been fishing for as long as I can remember. For me, it's always been more than just a hobby. It's a kind of meditation. The quiet, the sound of water flowing, the darkness closing in as the sun disappears. It's all part of what I love about it. I know it might sound strange, but night fishing has always been my favorite. There's something about the calmness of the night that just feels right. Well, at least it used to. This happened last year, out on the Deschutes River in Oregon. I know this area pretty well. I've been coming out here for years, often alone. It's remote, but that's part of the charm. The only sounds you usually hear are crickets, the rush of the river, and occasionally the distant howl of some coyote. So that night, I set up my camp like I always do. Nothing fancy, just my tent, a small fire, and my fishing gear. I had everything set for a peaceful night by the river. It was supposed to be just me, the trout, and the stars. Things started getting weird around 11 p.m. I was sitting on a rock near the river, casting and reeling in, when I suddenly got this feeling that I wasn't alone. You know that feeling, when the hair on the back of your neck stands up and you're just aware of something. I looked across the river, and that's when I saw it. 2 eyes, reflecting back at me, just beyond the tree line. At first I thought it might have been a deer or maybe an owl, but these eyes were high, much higher than any deer or elk I've ever seen out here. I'm talking 8, maybe 9 feet up. I flicked my flashlight towards it, and for a second the light bounced back, hitting those eyes just right, making them glow. They didn't move. They just stared right at me. And I swear, there was something about the way they watched. It didn't feel like an animal's curiosity. It felt like intent. I remember standing there just staring back, trying to convince myself it was nothing, maybe some weird optical illusion or a trick of the light. But as I stood there, the air got heavy. I can't really describe it better than that, like the night was suddenly holding its breath. My gut was telling me something was wrong, and my instincts were screaming at me to get back to camp. So that's what I did. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off that spot until I reached my tent. I sat by my fire for a while, trying to shake the unease. I didn't hear any movement after that, no rustling, no splashes. It was just quiet. Too quiet. I'm used to the typical night sounds, and when everything goes silent like that, it's never a good sign. Eventually I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and tried to get some sleep. I wish I could say that was the end of it. But things only got worse. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was still dark. The fire had died down, just a few embers left glowing. What woke me wasn't a sound. It was more like a feeling, the kind that sends a chill through your entire body before you're even fully awake. And then I heard it. Heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from the tree line, moving towards my camp. Not an animal crashing through the woods. These were slow, almost cautious steps, like something or someone was trying not to be noticed. My heart was pounding, and I remember holding my breath, hoping whoever it was would just keep walking. But then I heard it, right outside my tent. A low, rumbling grunt, followed by a deep sniffing sound. I froze. The footsteps circled my tent, slow and heavy. I could hear branches snapping under the weight. My cooler was only a few feet away from the tent flap, and whatever it was must have found it, because I heard it being dragged across the ground. I listened as the lid popped open, and the unmistakable sound of fish slapping against plastic echoed in the silence. I was terrified. I've been out in the woods plenty of times and have had my fair share of encounters with bears and other animals, but this felt different. There was a kind of intelligence to the way it moved, like it knew exactly what it was doing. And the smell. I could smell it through the tent. This awful pungent stench, like wet dog mixed with something rotten. It lingered, making my stomach churn. I don't know how long I laid there just listening. Minutes? Hours? All I knew was that I wasn't about to unzip that tent. Eventually the footsteps started to move away, back towards the river, and then they just faded into the night. I didn't sleep after that. I just laid there, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for the sound to come back. But it didn't. When the first light of dawn broke, I cautiously unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The cooler was about 10 feet from where I'd left it, tipped over, with deep scratches raked across the lid. The fish I had caught were gone, not a single one left. What really shook me, though, were the footprints. They were massive, bigger than my boots by a long shot, and the depth of them, whatever made them, was heavy. I could see where they circled my tent, where they stood right next to my cooler, and then headed off towards the river. I packed up as quickly as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see those eyes staring at me again. I've heard stories, you know, about strange things in the woods. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. I always thought it was just stories people told to spook each other, but now, I don't know. I'm not saying that's what it was, but I've never felt fear like that before, not out here, not anywhere. It was primal, like every part of me was screaming to get away. I haven't been back to that spot since. Hell, I haven't even gone night fishing again, and I don't think I will. I keep trying to tell myself it was just a bear, or maybe even someone messing with me. But deep down, I know that's not true. There was something out there that night, something watching me. And whatever it was, it wanted me to know it was there. I've shared this story with a few people, and most of them laugh it off, tell me I was just imagining things, that the dark can play tricks on you. Maybe they're right. But I've been out in those woods too many times to mistake something like that. I know what I felt, and I know what I saw. Those eyes, the heavy footsteps, the scratches. It was real. And even now, when I close my eyes, I can still see those eyes staring back at me from across the river, unblinking, watching. Sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet, I still get that feeling, like I'm being watched. And I'll catch myself glancing towards the tree line, half expecting to see those eyes again. I don't think I'll ever forget that night. And I don't think I'll ever feel truly alone in the woods again. All right, so I never thought I'd be one of those people sharing something like this, but I can't shake what happened. It's been eating at me ever since, and I just need to put it out there. I'm Margaret, and I work as a park ranger in a state park here in North Carolina. Been doing it for about 8 years now. You get used to the loneliness, the quiet nights, and the strange noises. It becomes background noise until it doesn't. Last summer, we started getting reports from campers and hikers about these weird, echoing screams in the middle of the night. Not the usual animal calls. People said it was unlike anything they'd heard before, loud, guttural, and almost desperate. I brushed it off at first. The woods can play tricks on people, especially at night, and you'd be surprised how many folks misidentify animal calls. But after the 3rd or 4th report, my supervisor asked me to check it out. It was my turn to take the night shift anyway, so I agreed. The night I went out, it was one of those evenings where the air feels thick, humid and heavy, like even the forest is holding its breath. I had my flashlight, my radio, the usual gear. The plan was to take a quick sweep through some of the isolated trails, just enough to reassure myself, and the boss, that everything was normal. Around 11 p.m., I started down this one trail we call Ridge Path. It's not a popular one, a bit out of the way and pretty overgrown. I figured it would be a good spot to start since the screams were reported nearby. Almost immediately, I noticed this smell, like something rotting. I've come across dead animals before, but this was different. Stronger, like something had been left out in the sun for days. It was cloying, making me gag a bit. I kept moving, shining my light around, but there was nothing visible. Just that smell lingering in the air. Then I saw the footprints. I know the trails like the back of my hand, and I've seen all sorts of animal tracks over the years, but these, they were massive. Bigger than any bear print I've ever seen, and they were deep, like something heavy had walked through the mud. The shape was weird too, almost human-like, but with toes that were spread out wider, more ape-like. I remember squatting down to get a closer look, and I felt my stomach drop. Whatever made those prints was not something I wanted to meet. I radioed back to the station, just letting them know my location, trying not to sound like I was freaking out. Then I heard it, that scream. It cut through the night like a knife, echoing off the trees. It sounded far, but loud enough that I could feel it in my chest. My first thought was that maybe someone was hurt, but there was this undercurrent to the sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I've never heard anything like it. It was almost like a mix of an angry growl and a person yelling in pain. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like forever, trying to decide whether to head towards the sound or back to my Jeep. Curiosity got the better of me, or maybe it was just my job kicking in, but I took a few steps further down the trail. That's when I saw it. It crossed the trail ahead of me just for a split second, caught in the beam of my flashlight. Huge. I mean taller than any person I've ever seen, and broad, like it could have snapped a tree in half without trying. The figure moved fast, almost gliding across the path, and then it was gone, swallowed by the dark. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't get a clear look at its face, just a flash of dark fur and an impression of something massive and upright. I tried to follow it with my flashlight, sweeping it through the trees, but all I could see were the shadows dancing between the branches. Then came the growling, deep, resonant, coming from somewhere in the dark to my left. It wasn't like a bear or anything else I knew. It had this weird, almost deliberate cadence to it, like it was aware I was there and wasn't happy about it. I'm not going to lie, I panicked. That feeling of being watched was so intense it was like a physical weight pressing on me. My legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to back away, keeping my light aimed into the woods. The growling got louder, and I swear I could hear movement in the underbrush, like it was circling me. I turned and bolted, stumbling back down the trail towards my Jeep. I'm not proud of it, but at that point, all I could think was that I needed to get out. When I got back to the Jeep, I jumped in, locked the doors, and just sat there for a moment trying to catch my breath. The forest was quiet again, like nothing had happened. No growling, no screams, just the rustle of leaves in the wind. I turned the engine on, and as my headlights lit up the trail, I thought I saw something, a pair of eyes reflecting back at me from the trees. But then I blinked, and they were gone. I drove back to the station and reported what I'd seen, but honestly, I left out a lot of details. I didn't want them to think I'd lost it. The guys at the station just kind of shrugged it off. Probably a bear, they said, maybe a cougar. But I know what I saw. Bears don't walk like that, and cougars sure as hell don't leave footprints like the ones I saw. Since that night, I haven't gone back to that part of the park. I make excuses, trade shifts, anything to avoid it. I still hear the screams sometimes, late at night when I'm on patrol, but I pretend I don't. Whatever's out there, I don't want to know. It's like the woods have secrets they don't want to share, and I'm fine with that. I've never been a superstitious person, but there's something about that part of the forest that just feels wrong, like it's watching, waiting. I've got no explanation for it, and maybe that's the worst part, knowing there's something out there that I can't understand, and that I might never be able to. If you ever find yourself hiking through a state park at night and you hear something that doesn't quite sound right, turn around, trust your gut, because sometimes the things we think we know about the woods are just a mask for what's really out there, hiding in the dark. This happened a few years ago, but I still think about it all the time, especially when the nights get really quiet. I've told a few friends, but I always get these looks, like the kind where they're trying to decide if I'm pulling their leg or if I've just lost my mind. But I swear, every part of this is true. So, my grandpa had this old cabin up in the Catskills. It was a small, secluded place that he built himself way back in the day. Nothing fancy, just a simple wooden cabin with a stone fireplace surrounded by pine trees and a little garden in the back where he used to grow vegetables. There was a chicken coop too, mostly for fresh eggs. Grandpa loved that place, but it was pretty isolated. You're talking miles of winding dirt roads just to get there, and no neighbors for what felt like forever. I'd spent a lot of time up there growing up, usually with family, but this one weekend I decided to go up by myself. My grandpa wasn't doing so great health-wise, and my parents thought it might be good for me to check in on the place, make sure it was all in order. I figured it would be a nice, quiet getaway. Maybe I could do some reading, make a fire, clear my head for a bit. I didn't really think much of it. It was late October, and the air was crisp, that kind of chill that made you want to wrap up in flannel. I got there just before sunset, settled in, and made myself some instant noodles. The place had electricity, but it wasn't exactly modernized. I turned on the old lamp in the living room, the kind with the brass base and the faded shade, and the light flickered a bit before finally holding steady. There's something about those flickering lights that make you feel like you're 1,000 miles from anyone. I guess I kind of was. Anyway, it must have been around 10 when things started getting strange. I was sitting on the worn-out couch, scrolling through my phone, trying to get enough signal to load a podcast. The wind was picking up outside, and the trees were swaying, making that creaking sound they do when they're bending just enough to touch each other. Then, out of nowhere, I heard this loud thud, like something hit the wall of the cabin. It wasn't a branch or anything. It was deliberate, like someone thrown a rock right at the side of the house. My first thought was maybe an animal, a deer or a bear, but it seemed too intentional, you know. I stood up, went to the window by the door, and peered out. I couldn't see much, just the outline of the porch and a bunch of darkness beyond that. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. I even laughed a little, trying to shake off that uneasy feeling, But then a minute later, there it was again. Thud, and then another. It wasn't just one spot this time. It was like something was moving around, thumping the walls, almost testing them. I felt my stomach tighten. That kind of instinct that tells you something's just not right. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and cracked the door open, the old hinges squealing in protest. The cold air rushed in, and I stepped out onto the porch. The beam from the flashlight cut through the dark, but everything looked the same. The garden, the coop, the old fence, all exactly where they should be. But just as I was about to head back inside, I caught a glimpse of something. It was quick, almost like a shadow shifting between the trees, but it was big, tall, like much taller than any person. It wasn't moving like a person either. It sort of glided, silently between the pines, and then it just stopped. And that's when I realized it was watching me. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I wanted to believe it was a trick of the light, but I knew it wasn't. I could make out the outline, broad shoulders, a head, and these two eyes that seemed to reflect the flashlight just enough for me to notice. I don't know how long I stood there, staring back at it, but it felt like forever. It didn't move. It was like it was waiting for something, just standing there, half hidden by the trees. I don't think I've ever moved as fast as I did in that moment. I bolted back inside, slammed the door and locked it. My hands were shaking so much I could barely get the bolt into place. I went around the cabin, locking every window, drawing the old curtains shut. I felt stupid, like some kid hiding from a monster under his bed, but I didn't care. I just had this overwhelming sense that whatever was out there wasn't just passing through. It was there for a reason. I turned off the lights and sat in the dark, just listening. The wind outside seemed to have died down, and for a while there was nothing but silence. I thought maybe it had gone, that I'd scared it off, whatever it was. Then I heard the steps, heavy, deliberate steps, coming from the porch. The wooden boards creaked under the weight, and I could hear it moving slowly, almost cautiously, right up to the front door. I don't know if I've ever felt that kind of fear before, the kind that makes you feel like you're completely helpless. I had nothing to defend myself with, just a flimsy flashlight and a kitchen knife that I'd grabbed on my way back in. I stayed as quiet as I could, barely breathing, hoping it would just give up and leave. But it didn't. It moved around the cabin, the steps echoing along the porch, then around the side, towards the back where the chicken coop was. I heard the chickens start to squawk, the kind of frantic noise they make when something's after them. And then, suddenly, silence. Just like that. Dead quiet. I don't think I slept at all that night. I just sat there listening, waiting for the next sound, the next thud, the next creak. But eventually, everything went still. I must have drifted off at some point, because the next thing I knew, the sun was coming up, casting this pale light through the curtains. It was almost like nothing had happened, like it had all been a nightmare. Except I knew it hadn't. When I finally worked up the courage to go outside, I found the chicken coop door hanging open. The fence around the garden had been knocked down, not broken, but like something had just walked right through it. And the chickens? Gone. Not a single feather, no sign of struggle. Just gone. I've tried to rationalize it 1,000 times since then. Maybe it was a bear, maybe some weirdo messing with me. But bears don't just stand there watching, and people don't glide between trees like that or move that quietly. I've thought about going back, about trying to see if I could find some kind of explanation. But I haven't. Not alone, anyway. That was the last time I stayed at my grandpa's cabin by myself. I still visit, but only with family, and never overnight. Every time I go back, I catch myself glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see that silhouette again, just standing there, waiting. Whatever it was, it's like it wanted me to know it was there, like it needed me to see it, to know that place wasn't just mine, and I got the message loud and clear. All right, I'm not the type to post about strange experiences online, but I just can't shake this off. Maybe writing it out will help me make some sense of it, or maybe it'll just keep me up at night all over again. Anyway, here's what happened to me and my friends at Quiet Lake in Minnesota. It's been a few months now, and I still get chills just thinking about it. We were a group of 5, me, my best friend Ryan, his girlfriend Jess, and 2 of our friends, Sam and Abby. It was supposed to be one of those perfect stress-free weekends. Quiet Lake is one of those places that, even from the name, sounds like an escape. I'd been feeling worn down by work, and the thought of a weekend without phone service, with nothing but stars overhead and the sound of a crackling campfire, sounded like exactly what I needed. We got there pretty early that Friday. The sun was bright, the sky was blue, just one of those perfect late summer days. The lake was calm, surrounded by thick woods. It was like a picture on a postcard, honestly. We found a spot right near the shore, set up our tents, and spent the day just hanging out. I remember thinking how beautiful it was, how I couldn't understand why more people didn't come out to this place. I mean, it was remote, sure, but that was part of the appeal. As the sun set, we built a fire, roasted marshmallows, and just talked. It was normal, laughing, telling stories, even a few ghost stories just to mess with each other. But by around midnight, the vibe changed. The laughter kind of died down, and we all got this weird, uneasy feeling. I think it was Jess who mentioned it first, how it suddenly felt like we weren't alone. And it wasn't just that feeling you get when you tell spooky stories in the dark. It was different, heavy, almost like the air got thicker. I tried to brush it off as my imagination. We all did, I think. But as the night went on, it became impossible to ignore. Somewhere around 2 a.m., I started hearing it. A deep, steady breathing, almost like someone was standing right outside our tent. It wasn't close at first, more like at the edge of the campsite near the trees. I held my breath, thinking maybe it was one of the others playing a joke, but I could hear Ryan shifting next to me. He was awake too. Then Jess whispered, asking if we heard it. She sounded scared. The breathing kept getting louder, like whatever it was circling us, moving closer and then farther away again. No one wanted to say it, but we were all thinking the same thing. We were being watched. I could feel my heart pounding, and my mind kept racing between trying to stay quiet and wanting to scream. I mean, logically I wanted to believe it was some animal, maybe a deer or something, but that breathing, it was too deliberate, too human-like, and way too heavy. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, listening to that breathing slowly circling the tents. Nobody dared to unzip and look outside. We were too scared. Eventually, it just stopped. Silence. Not the good kind either. It was so quiet it almost felt wrong, like even the crickets had decided they wanted no part of whatever was going on. I didn't sleep at all that night, and I don't think anyone else did either. We stayed up, frozen, until dawn. When the sun came up, we finally unzipped our tents and stepped out. There wasn't anything weird at first, but as we walked closer to the water, Jess suddenly pointed to the sand. There were these huge footprints, way bigger than any of ours. They were long, kind of narrow, and the toes were splayed out, like nothing I'd ever seen. The strangest part was the depth of them. They sank into the sand way more than our prints did, which meant whatever made them was heavy, really heavy. I wanted to leave. I told the others that we should pack up and just go home. I mean, it wasn't like we had anything to prove by staying there after what had happened. But Ryan and Sam brushed it off, said it was probably some prank or maybe a bear. They laughed it off, and maybe they were just trying to keep things light so they wouldn't have to admit how freaked out they were. Jess wanted to go too, but she didn't want to be the one to make a big deal out of it if the others weren't. So we stayed. That day felt off from the start. The whole time I felt like we were being watched. Every now and then I'd catch myself glancing towards the tree line, expecting to see something, someone standing there. We tried to make the best of it, fished a bit, went for a swim, but that uneasy feeling never really left. The whole time I couldn't shake the thought that whatever had been outside our tents the night before was still somewhere nearby. It was around dusk when things got bad again. We had the fire going, and the sun had just dipped below the horizon. That's when I saw it. Across the lake, near where the shore curved and the trees almost touched the water, there was this tall shape. It was hard to see at first, but I knew it wasn't just a tree. It was too dark, too solid. It was standing there, right at the edge of the water, like it was watching us. I nudged Ryan and pointed, and as soon as he looked, his face went pale. He tried to play it off, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Jess saw it too, and soon enough we were all staring at this thing. It was tall, maybe 7, 8 feet, and it was just standing there, not moving. I wanted to scream, wanted to yell at everyone to get in the car, but it was like my voice just got caught in my throat. Then it moved, just a step, but enough for us to see that it was definitely not a tree. It was like it was testing us, seeing what we'd do. That was enough for me. I whispered to the others that we needed to leave right then, and this time, no one argued. We didn't even bother putting the fire out. We just grabbed what we could, ran to the car and piled in. The drive out of there was tense. The whole time, I kept looking out the window, expecting to see that figure again, running alongside us, or standing in the middle of the road. It felt like it was right behind us, just out of sight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was following us, even as we sped away. We finally made it to the main road, and that's when I started to feel a bit of relief, like maybe we were safe. But even now, months later, I can still hear that breathing when I'm lying in bed at night. And those footprints, I can't explain them. No one really talks about it anymore. It's like we all silently agreed to just pretend it never happened, but I can tell it's still on everyone's mind. Jess and I have talked about it a couple of times, and she says she still dreams about that shape standing across the lake watching us. I don't know what it was. I don't think I want to know. But whatever it wasn't just some animal. It knew we were there, and it wanted us to know it too. I haven't been camping since, and I don't think I ever will again. Something about that place felt wrong, like we were somewhere we weren't supposed to be, and whoever or whatever was out there wanted to make sure we knew it. I never thought I'd end up sharing this story with anyone. Honestly, I've been trying to forget it ever happened, but after a lot of sleepless nights, I figured maybe getting it off my chest would help. I want to be clear, I'm not someone who scares easily. I've spent years hiking in deep forests, even done some solo camping. But what happened in that house in Pennsylvania still makes the hair on my neck stand up when I think about it. So it all started when I inherited this old house from an uncle I barely knew. He was the kind of relative that showed up once a year at Thanksgiving, then disappeared into the background for the rest of the time. I knew he lived somewhere out in the woods, but I had no clue it was a place like this. When the papers came through, I was surprised. Part of me wanted to sell it right away, but another part of me figured, why not fix it up a little? Maybe even make it a weekend getaway spot. The house itself was in a remote area, surrounded by forest in every direction. There was a gravel road that led up to it, and you wouldn't find another house for miles. Honestly, that isolation was part of the appeal at first. I took a couple of weeks off work and drove out there with some tools and supplies, planning to give the place a facelift. It was old, but still solid. It had that classic creaky floorboard charm and a stone basement that, I thought, would be cool to turn into a workshop or something. It was on the second day while I was clearing out the basement that things started to get weird. I was hauling out some old junk, rusted metal shelves, and a couple of broken chairs that looked like they'd been down there since the 60s. I remember the air being cold and kind of damp, that basement smell like old cement and mildew. Then I heard it. A scraping sound, faint but distinct, like something sharp running against metal or glass. It made me stop in my tracks. I thought maybe it was just an animal, a raccoon or a stray cat brushing up against the windows up on the ground floor. Curious, I dropped what I was doing and made my way back upstairs. The sound had stopped by then, but something about it had been off. Not like an animal, it was too deliberate. I stepped out the back door, and that's when I saw it. A figure, big, dark, and definitely covered in hair. It was moving away from the house, heading back into the woods. For a second, I thought maybe it was a bear, but the way it moved, it wasn't on all fours. It had this hunch to it, almost like a person trying to keep low. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know what to do, so I just stood there, watching as it vanished between the trees. I remember trying to convince myself I imagined it. After all, I was tired from working all day, and I hadn't been in that kind of isolated environment for years. I mean, when you're out there alone, sometimes your mind plays tricks on you, right? I forced myself back inside, double-checked the locks, and went to bed. But I barely slept. Every creak and groan the house made seemed amplified by the silence, and I just kept thinking about that shape, the way it moved. A few days later, I was almost starting to forget about it. I was making good progress on the repairs, and things felt a bit more normal. That's when the real nightmare began. I woke up one morning to find the door to the cellar, which I had locked, I'm positive, completely torn off. Not just broken, but ripped from its hinges. The door was on the ground, and there were scratches all over it, deep gouges like something had clawed at it until it gave way. Cans of food I'd stored down there were strewn across the floor, some of them ripped open like they were nothing. I stood there for a long time, just staring. My stomach twisted into knots, and this awful feeling settled in my chest. Something had been inside the house. Something had the strength to tear that door apart. I tried to tell myself maybe it was a bear after all, but even that didn't make sense. There weren't any claw marks on the outside of the door. They were all on the inside, like it had been locked in and trying to get out. After that, I did everything I could think of to secure the place. I put new locks on every door, even braced some of them with metal bars. I wanted to believe it was enough, but there was something else, this constant nagging feeling that I was being watched. I'd be working in the living room or clearing out the attic, and I'd get this overwhelming urge to look out the window, expecting to see something standing just beyond the tree line. I never saw anything during the day, but at night I could hear things. Footsteps, faint but deliberate, moving around the house. And once, just once, I swear I heard breathing, deep and slow, just outside my bedroom window. By this point I was barely sleeping. I had started to dread the nights. The last straw was one evening when I was sitting in the living room, trying to distract myself with some old magazines I'd found in a closet. It was dark outside, pitch black, and there was no moon that night. Suddenly, there was this sound, a low, guttural growl, followed by a scraping noise, just like the one I'd heard that first day in the basement. It was coming from the front door. My heart felt like it was about to explode out of my chest. I grabbed a flashlight and crept over to the door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the light steady. I pointed the beam through the small window at the top of the door, and for just a split second, I saw it, a face. It was only partially lit, but I'll never forget it. Covered in matted hair, with eyes that seemed almost human, but darker, like there was nothing behind them but malice. And then it was gone, disappearing into the darkness faster than I could react. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat there in the middle of the living room, clutching a kitchen knife and waiting for morning. I left the house the next day. I packed up whatever I could fit in my truck and drove away without looking back. I never even finished the renovations. A few weeks later, I put it up for sale at a price low enough that it practically guaranteed a quick sale. I didn't care about the money, I just wanted it gone out of my life. I've told people I sold it because it was too much work, that I wasn't cut out for fixing up an old place like that. But the truth is, I was terrified. Whatever was out there in those woods, it didn't want me there, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out why. Even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched sometimes. I'll be in my apartment surrounded by people, and suddenly feel that same chill, that same instinct that tells you something is wrong. I've started keeping my curtains closed at night, and I avoid dark, quiet places whenever I can. I don't know what I saw out there, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to know. All I know is that whatever it wasn't just an animal, and it wasn't something I ever want to see again. I've never been the kind of person to scare easily. Growing up in rural Idaho, you get used to strange noises, rustling in the brush, and the occasional coyote call in the dead of night. It's part of the package deal when you live in the middle of nowhere. I've always been comfortable being outside after dark, tending to my small vegetable patch, enjoying the peace and quiet that comes once the sun dips below the horizon. But that changed last fall, and to be honest, I don't think I'll ever shake off what happened that night. It was mid-October, and we'd been having a few unseasonably warm nights. I remember this one particular night, I decided to head out to my little vegetable patch around 10 p.m. I was used to doing this. Sometimes the days got away from me, and checking on the plants was easier when it was quiet, with no distractions. Plus, there was something peaceful about it. Just me, my lantern, and the cool night breeze rustling through the cornstalks and bean plants. That night, I took my flashlight, a big, heavy one that lit up most of the area in front of me. I was halfway through the rows of corn, checking the soil and making a mental note to add some compost the next day, when I saw it. Two glowing reflections staring back at me from between the rows. At first, I thought it was a deer. They often wandered into the garden for a snack. I even muttered something to myself like, "Well, look who's here to ruin my garden again." I stepped closer, wanting to get a better look. But the closer I got, the more wrong everything felt. Those eyes were high, much higher than a deer's should have been. I'm not sure why, but I froze. I pointed my flashlight directly at it, and that's when I realized it wasn't a deer. What I saw still sends chills down my spine just thinking about it. There, standing between the rows of corn, was this tall shape. It must have been over 7 feet, but it wasn't just the height. It moved, not like an animal. It moved like a person, almost cautious, deliberate. The eyes reflected the light back at me, and the way they blinked, it just wasn't right. It was like it was thinking, like it was aware. My brain struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. I could barely make out its silhouette, but I could tell it had long arms, much longer than they should be, and it was covered in dark, matted hair. I took a step back, and the creature shifted its weight, almost like it was going to follow me. I didn't wait to find out if it would. I turned on my heel and bolted back towards the house. I'm not a runner, but I swear I've never moved that fast in my life. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears, and as I got closer to the house, I heard this deep guttural noise, a grunting sound that reverberated through the air. It wasn't an animal sound, at least not any animal I'd ever heard around here. It was low, almost like a warning. I reached my back door, fumbling with the handle, and practically threw myself inside. I slammed the door shut and locked it, pressing my back against it, as if that flimsy piece of wood would actually keep something that size out. My heart was racing, and I tried to catch my breath. I turned off my flashlight, letting the darkness swallow the room. Maybe if the house looked quiet, whatever was out there would just go away. A few seconds later I heard it. Heavy footsteps, like something massive was moving just outside. I crept towards the window, barely daring to peek out. I could see a shadow moving along the side of the house, this huge dark mass that blocked out the moonlight. I remember holding my breath, terrified that whatever it was would see me. It paused right by the window, and I swear for a moment it felt like it knew I was there. I could see the outline of its head, massive and misshapen, slowly turning as if it was listening for something. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow moved on, disappearing back into the direction of the garden. I stayed by that window for what felt like hours, listening, waiting to hear if it would come back. But eventually, everything went quiet. No footsteps, no grunting, just the sound of crickets and the wind in the trees. I must have stood there until almost dawn, too scared to move, too scared to even turn on a light. When the first light of morning finally crept over the horizon, I worked up the courage to go back outside. I had to know if I'd imagined the whole thing, if maybe it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. But when I got to the garden, my heart sank. The rows of corn I'd been tending were destroyed, trampled, crushed into the dirt like something huge had barreled through them. There were these massive impressions in the soil, almost like footprints but too large, too strange. The plants were broken, some of them twisted like they'd been grabbed and yanked. I've tried to rationalize it 100 times since then. Maybe it was a bear, though I've never seen one around here, and they don't usually walk like that. Maybe it was some kind of prank, though who would be out here, in the middle of nowhere at that hour? Nothing about it made sense, and the more I think about it, the less I want to understand what I saw that night. Since then, I haven't gone back to the garden after dark. I make sure to finish everything before the sun sets, and if I forget something, well, it can wait until morning. I don't know if whatever I saw that night will come back, but I'm not willing to take that chance. Even now, months later, I still get a chill when I look out at the garden after dark. It's like there's this constant reminder in the back of my mind that whatever it was, it's still out there, somewhere, and maybe it's watching, waiting for me to make the same mistake again. I've thought about telling more people about it, maybe even calling someone to come take a look. But what would I say? that I saw a giant creature with glowing eyes in my garden. They'd think I was crazy. Heck, sometimes I think I'm crazy. But I know what I saw. And I know I'll never forget that feeling, that deep, instinctual fear that something was out there, something that shouldn't exist, watching me. I still have those footprints in the dirt, though they've mostly faded now. Sometimes I look at them, and I'm reminded of that night all over again, the way the air felt heavy, the way my heart pounded in my chest, the way those eyes blinked at me from between the rows of corn. It's strange how one moment can change everything. I used to love the night, the peace it brought. Now, I'd rather not take my chances. I guess I'm sharing this because I don't know what else to do. I keep replaying it in my mind, hoping I'll find some detail that makes everything make sense, but I never do. All I'm left with are questions and a nagging feeling that maybe, just maybe, there's more out there than we'd like to believe. And whatever it is, it's better left undisturbed. All right, so let me tell you about the scariest night of my life. Honestly, I never thought I'd be the one typing something like this. I used to roll my eyes at these kinds of stories, but after what happened to me, I can't just keep it to myself. Maybe some of you will think I'm making this up, and I get it, I really do. But this is what I experienced, and to this day, I still can't shake it off. I'm a truck driver. I've been driving long hauls for years, and I usually enjoy the quiet stretches of road at night. No traffic, no people, just me and the road. There's this particular route I used to take between Colorado and Utah. It's a lonely strip of asphalt that cuts through miles of nothing but dry, empty land. It's always been kind of eerie, but I was used to it, until that night. I was about halfway through the drive, maybe 2 a.m., and I hadn't seen another vehicle for hours. It was one of those nights where everything felt extra dark, like the stars were hiding, and even my headlights barely seemed to cut through the blackness. I was sipping on my coffee, trying to keep myself awake, when something bolted across the road in front of me, so fast that I barely had time to react. I slammed on the brakes, my truck groaning to a stop, the whole cab shuddering as everything in it shifted forward. My first thought was that it was a deer, or maybe an elk. It was that big. But as I sat there, breathing heavily, trying to calm my nerves, I realized it wasn't shaped like any animal I'd ever seen. It was upright, and it moved too fluidly to be a deer. Whatever it was tall, really tall, and covered in dark hair. I know it sounds insane, but it almost looked human, a massive, hairy human. I'm not the kind of guy who scares easily. I've seen my share of weird things on the road, and when you spend as much time alone as I do, your mind can play tricks on you. But this felt different. I sat there for a moment, engine idling, my heart pounding in my ears, trying to wrap my head around what I'd just seen. And then, like an idiot, I decided to get out and check. I grabbed my flashlight, the beam barely piercing the darkness beyond the truck. It was dead quiet outside. The kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. No wind, no crickets, nothing. I walked around to the front of the truck, scanning the ground. And that's when I saw them. The footprints. Massive footprints, sunk deep into the dry dirt on the side of the road. I'm not talking about bear prints or anything like that. These were shaped like human feet, just way too big. I'd say each one was at least twice the size of mine, and they were spaced far apart, like whatever made them was taking huge strides. I remember swallowing hard, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. Something about those prints made my skin crawl. They were fresh, like it had just crossed the road right before I stopped. That's when I felt it, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck. You know when you can just tell someone's watching you? My flashlight flicked over the darkness, and I strained my eyes, trying to see past the edge of the road. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. There was something out there, just beyond the reach of the light, and it was watching me. I've never felt so exposed in my life. It was like every instinct I had was screaming at me to get back in the truck. I'm not ashamed to say that I listened. I backed up slowly, not taking my eyes off the darkness, until I felt the side of the truck behind me. I climbed back in, locked the doors, and just sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath. I felt like a kid again, scared of the monster under the bed. Except this time, I knew the monster was real. I started the engine back up, the roar of it breaking the silence, and I took off down that road faster than I probably should have. My eyes kept darting to the side mirrors, half expecting to see something running after me. The rest of that drive was a blur. I just wanted to put as much distance between me and whatever that thing was as possible. I've tried to rationalize it since then. Maybe it was a bear. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe my eyes played tricks on me. But I've seen bears before and I know what tired feels like. This was different. It moved like nothing I've ever seen, fast, smooth, almost too graceful for something so big. And those eyes, I swear, just before it disappeared into the dark, I caught a glimpse of its eyes reflecting in my headlights. They were too high off the ground to be any normal animal, and they had this strange, almost intelligent glint to them. I haven't driven that road at night since. I'll go out of my way to avoid it, even if it adds hours to my route. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I can't shake the feeling that whatever I saw that night is still out there, somewhere in that empty stretch of nowhere, waiting. Sometimes, when I'm on a long drive and the night gets quiet, I'll think about those footprints, about that feeling of being watched, and I'll get that same chill down my spine. I don't know what it was. I'm not going to sit here and tell you it was Bigfoot or some other creature out of a campfire story, but I know what I saw, and I know how it made me feel, and whatever it wasn't something I ever want to see again. I've heard other drivers talk about weird things out on the road, strange lights, shadows that move, figures standing by the side of the highway. I always thought they were just stories, the kind of thing people say to pass the time. Now, I'm not so sure, so yeah, that's my story. I'm not here to convince anyone or prove anything. I just needed to get it off my chest. Maybe some of you have seen something similar. Maybe not. But if you ever find yourself on a dark, empty road between Colorado and Utah in the middle of the night, keep your eyes open. And if you see something cross the road in front of you, something that shouldn't be there, do yourself a favor. Just keep driving. I want to share something that happened to me a while back. Even now, just thinking about it sends chills down my spine. It's one of those things you try to put behind you, but every now and then, something brings it all back. And honestly, I don't think I'll ever be able to forget it. So, this was about a year ago. I had this big project going on. I'm a writer, and I needed a break from the noise and distractions of city life. A friend suggested I rent a cabin, somewhere isolated, where I could just be alone with my thoughts and actually get some work done. I liked the sound of it. I found this little cabin in the woods of Maine, about as remote as you could get. I figured it would be perfect. No distractions, no people, just the trees and my laptop. When I got there, it was exactly what I'd hoped for. It was quiet, peaceful, and had this rustic charm that felt almost therapeutic. There was no Wi-Fi, no cell service, just me and the forest. I remember stepping out of my car and just listening to the wind in the trees, the kind of silence that's so rare nowadays. It felt good. The cabin was small, nothing fancy, but it had everything I needed. A kitchen, a bedroom, and this little wood stove that kept the place nice and warm. I settled in, made myself a cup of tea, and started unpacking. The first day was uneventful. I got some writing done, cooked myself dinner, and went to bed early. It was the kind of peace I'd been craving for weeks. But that night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to this strange noise outside. It sounded like footsteps. Not the kind of soft rustling you'd expect from an animal, but heavy, deliberate steps. I told myself it was probably just a deer, maybe even a bear, and forced myself back to sleep. The next day, everything seemed normal. I didn't think too much about the noise. I spent most of the day on my laptop, trying to get through a tough chapter. By the time the sun went down, I was feeling pretty good about my progress. I made some dinner and decided to read for a while before bed. That's when I heard it again, the footsteps. This time they were closer. They seemed to circle the cabin, slow and heavy. I turned off the lights and crept to the window, trying to see what it was, but it was pitch dark outside. My heart was pounding, and I had this weird sense that whatever it wasn't just a curious animal. Then I saw it. A shadow, huge, moving past the window. I couldn't make out any details, just this large, dark shape. It paused, and for a moment I swear it looked right at me through the glass. I stumbled back, my heart in my throat. I didn't know what to do. I was in the middle of nowhere, and there was no one I could call. I just stood there, frozen, listening as the footsteps slowly faded into the woods. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I was tired. Maybe it was a trick of the light. But when I went outside to get some air, I noticed something on the windows. Handprints. Huge, smeared handprints on the glass, like someone, or something, had pressed its hands against the window to look inside. The prints were unlike anything I'd ever seen, massive, with fingers longer than any human's, and covered in what looked like coarse hair. My stomach dropped. It wasn't a dream. Something had been there right outside, watching me. I tried to keep myself busy that day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd hear something in the distance. Branches snapping, the rustle of leaves, and I'd feel my skin prickle. I wanted to leave, but it was already late in the day, and the idea of driving those winding roads in the dark felt even worse. I decided I'd stick it out one more night, and then leave first thing in the morning. That night was the worst of my life. It started with the footsteps again, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. I turned off all the lights and sat in the corner of the bedroom, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Then came the knocking. It wasn't a gentle tap. It was this heavy, rhythmic pounding, like something was trying to break the door down. I remember holding my breath, my hands shaking as I listened to the sound echo through the small cabin. And then, the breathing. I could hear it, just outside the bedroom window. This deep, raspy breathing, like whatever was out there was struggling with each inhale. It sounded wrong, like it wasn't supposed to be. I felt this cold dread wash over me, and I remember thinking that if I stayed quiet enough, maybe it would just go away. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just sat there listening to that horrible sound, praying for it to stop. It felt like hours, but eventually the noises started to fade. The footsteps moved away from the cabin, and everything went quiet again. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed in that corner until the first light of dawn started to peek through the curtains. The moment it was light enough, I grabbed my things and ran to my car. I didn't even bother packing properly. I just threw everything in the back seat and got out of there as fast as I could. Driving away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me down the road. But there was nothing. Just the trees, the empty road, and the growing distance between me and that cabin. I didn't stop until I reached a town about an hour away, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I never went back to that cabin. I never even contacted the owner to tell them what happened. I just wanted to forget. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear it. Those heavy footsteps, that raspy breathing. And I wonder if whatever it was is still out there, wandering through those woods, looking for the next cabin, the next person to watch. I don't know what it was, and honestly, I don't want to know. All I know is that I'm never going back to the woods again. I used to work on a sheep farm in Wyoming not too long ago, maybe about 2 years back. It wasn't a fancy job by any means, but it paid my bills, and I enjoyed being out there in the open, surrounded by nothing but fields, sheep, and the occasional rustle of the wind. Wyoming's landscapes could feel both beautiful and lonely, depending on the day. And man, the nights out there, they could be something else, a whole different kind of eerie. Anyway, I remember this one night vividly, and I wish I could forget it. It was late March, so the ground was still kind of soggy from the early thaw. It wasn't uncommon to have to check the fences at odd hours, just to make sure none of the sheep had wandered off or that some predator hadn't broken in. That night was one of those times. I got the call from my boss, who was back in town, saying he thought he heard something over the radio. Something about an odd noise, like the sheep were in distress. He asked if I could go check it out, and since it was my shift anyway, I grabbed my flashlight and a jacket and headed out. I remember how cold the air felt, even with my jacket on. The wind was biting, and the way it moved through the trees had this weird hollow sound that night. It's hard to describe, but it was like everything felt off balance. Even the sheep seemed quieter than usual. As I approached the far side of the pasture, I noticed something strange. There were gaps in the flock, like a few of them were just missing. I counted twice to make sure. 5 sheep gone. I figured they must have slipped through a weak spot in the fence or something, so I started looking for any damage. Then I saw them, these huge footprints. I'm talking massive, way bigger than anything I'd seen before. The ground was still wet from the melted snow, so the prints were deep, clear enough that I could see the shape of toes. At first I thought maybe it was a bear, but it didn't look quite right. Bears have those round, kind of clumsy prints, you know? These were longer, almost human-like, but way too big, and spaced too far apart, like whatever made them was taking massive strides. I tried to follow them, and that's when things got really weird. They led right into the tree line, towards this thick patch of forest that bordered the pasture. As I shined my flashlight around, I caught a glimpse of something moving, something tall, covered in this dark, matted hair. It wasn't just the sight that scared me, though. It was the way it moved. Fast, but not like an animal. More like something that knew it didn't want to be seen. I swear my heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. It was almost like it was there 1 second, then just melted into the dark. I'm not ashamed to admit I turned and ran. I didn't care about the missing sheep at that point. I just wanted to get back to the farmhouse. My boots slipped in the mud, and I stumbled a couple of times, but I didn't stop until I was inside. I slammed the door shut and locked it behind me, as if that flimsy lock would make a difference against whatever the hell I just saw. When I called my boss to tell him what happened, he just kind of sighed and said it was probably wolves, maybe a bear that got confused coming out of hibernation. He even laughed a bit, like I was overreacting. I wanted to argue, but how do you explain to someone that you saw something that shouldn't exist? I just said, sure, maybe, and hung up. The next day the sun came up and things felt more normal, almost like I could convince myself it was just my imagination, maybe a trick of the light. But then, when evening rolled around, I started feeling that anxiety in my gut again. I had this horrible sense that I wasn't done with whatever was out there. That night, I went out again. I didn't want to, but it was my job, and I had to make sure nothing else happened to the flock. I took a rifle with me this time, more for peace of mind than anything else. It was just past midnight when I noticed it. The sheep were huddled together, way more than usual. They looked spooked, all their heads pointing towards the far end of the field, almost like they knew something was out there. My flashlight caught something in the distance, just at the edge of the trees, a shape standing so still that for a second I thought maybe I was seeing things. But then it moved. It was the same thing I'd seen the night before, tall, bulky, covered in dark fur, and it was just standing there, staring at me. It didn't make a sound, didn't move closer, just watched. I can't even begin to explain the feeling that came over me, like every instinct I had was screaming at me to get away, but I was frozen. It felt like forever, but it couldn't have been more than a few seconds. Then, without a sound, it turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing behind the trees. Just like that. I stood there for a minute, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. I knew deep down that whatever it wasn't a bear, and it wasn't a wolf. It moved with this weird intelligence, like it knew exactly how to stay just far enough away to avoid me. I walked back to the farmhouse, hands shaking so bad I could barely keep hold of the rifle. I didn't sleep that night, just sat in the kitchen with the lights on, staring out the window, waiting for morning. The next day, I told my boss I was done. I couldn't keep going out there, not knowing what I might run into. He didn't argue, probably figured I was just some kid who couldn't handle the isolation. Maybe he was right. But to this day, I can't shake the feeling that what I saw was something that shouldn't be there, something that doesn't belong in those woods, or anywhere really. I've tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that maybe it was just a bear standing on its hind legs, or some weird optical illusion. But every time I think back to those footprints, or the way it moved, that smooth, almost deliberate stride, I know it wasn't something I could easily explain away. I don't tell many people about it because honestly, who would believe me? But I figured I'd share it here, just to get it off my chest. Maybe it was Bigfoot. Maybe it was something else. All I know is that I never want to see it again. And if you're ever out in those woods, keep your eyes open. There's something out there, and it's watching. This all happened about a year ago, and honestly, I still have trouble wrapping my head around it. I never thought I'd be that guy, the one with a creature story, but here we are. I've tried to just move on, but it keeps coming back, like a movie scene I can't shake, so I guess sharing it might help a bit. Anyway, here goes. It was supposed to be a chill weekend. Me, my buddies Chris and Tom, and a couple of rented kayaks. Nothing too crazy. We were out on Lake Michigan just exploring and trying to get away from everything for a bit. There's something really freeing about kayaking out there, with just water stretching for miles and that horizon that seems to go on forever. We didn't really have a plan, but at some point we spotted this little island. It was small, with just enough of a clearing in the middle for a few tents. It seemed like the perfect spot to set up camp for the night. We figured, why not? A night under the stars, maybe some beers, a campfire, the whole deal. So we pulled up our kayaks on the rocky shore, dragged our stuff to the clearing, and set up camp. It was already getting late by the time we got everything sorted, and the sun had dipped below the horizon. The fire was crackling, and we were just hanging out, talking about everything and nothing. At first, it was peaceful, the kind of quiet you just don't get in the city. But then, things started to feel off. It began with this weird sense like I was being watched. You know how sometimes you can just feel it, like there's a set of eyes on you, even if you can't see anything? That's how it was. I brushed it off at first. I mean, we're on a deserted island. What's going to be watching us? But then I noticed Chris, sitting across from me, looking over his shoulder like he heard something. I asked him if everything was cool, and he just shrugged, said he thought he heard something in the woods. I didn't pay much attention to it, but it wasn't long after that when I heard it too. It was a heavy sound like something big moving through the brush. The thing is, it wasn't just a random noise. It felt deliberate. Whatever it wasn't just wandering around. It felt like it was circling us. We all went quiet, just listening. The fire popped and cracked, and I swear every time it got quiet, I could hear these heavy footsteps, slow, almost methodical. I exchanged a look with Tom, and I could tell he was freaked out too. We grabbed our flashlights, cheap little things we got at a gas station on the way out. We started shining them into the woods, trying to see what was out there. For a minute, there was nothing, just darkness, trees, and shadows. And then, for just a second, I saw it. A figure, tall, hunched, covered in dark hair. It was right there, at the edge of the light, and before I could even react, it was gone, disappearing back into the trees. I didn't get a good look. It was so fast, almost like it was trying to stay hidden. But the size of it was huge, easily taller than any person I've ever seen. I wasn't the only one who saw it. Tom let out this half-gasp, half-swear, and Chris just said, "Did you guys see that?" We all nodded, and I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. I tried to play it cool, tried to tell myself it was probably just a deer or something, but deep down I knew. There was no way that was a deer, not that big, not moving like that. We tried to go back to the fire, pretend everything was normal, but the sounds kept coming. We'd hear branches snap, footsteps crunching through the underbrush. It was like the thing was still out there, just out of sight, watching us. We didn't talk much after that. We just sat there, huddled closer to the fire, shining our flashlights into the woods every few minutes. At some point, I don't know how long we sat like that, Chris just stood up and said, "Guys, we need to leave." It wasn't like him. Chris is usually the chill one, the guy who keeps things light. But he looked dead serious, and honestly, I was ready to agree. We packed up what we could, just the essentials, and made our way back to the kayaks. The whole time, I kept expecting to see that thing again, to feel it rush at us out of the dark, but it didn't. We got our kayaks in the water, and we paddled away from that island as fast as we could. The lake was pitch black, just this huge expanse of darkness all around us. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that creature standing at the shore, watching us leave. But there was nothing, just the outline of the island fading into the dark. We paddled until my arms were burning, until I was sure we were far enough away. We ended up finding a different spot on the mainland to camp, somewhere with other people around. None of us said much for the rest of the night. We were too shaken. The next morning, after the sun came up, we decided to go back, just to see. Maybe we'd find some sign that it was all in our heads, that we'd just let the dark and our imaginations get the best of us. But when we pulled our kayaks up onto that island again, the place felt different. It was quiet, like eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling, nothing. We walked back to where our campsite had been, and that's when we saw them. The footprints. They were huge, much bigger than any of ours, almost like a human's but broader, deeper. There was no mistaking it. Something, or someone, had been out there. We didn't stick around for long. I think seeing those prints made it all real for us. Whatever we'd seen the night before, it wasn't just in our heads. We packed up whatever we'd left behind and got out of there. None of us said it, but we all knew. We weren't coming back. Since then, I haven't been able to look at kayaking the same way. I used to love the feeling of being out in nature, of getting away from everything. But now, every time I think about it, I remember that night. I remember the feeling of being watched, the sound of those footsteps, the glimpse of that creature in the dark. I haven't been back to Lake Michigan, and I definitely haven't gone kayaking in any remote areas. I just can't shake the feeling that, whatever it was, it's still out there, somewhere, watching. I know how it sounds. Trust me, if someone else was telling me this story, I'd probably roll my eyes. But I was there. I saw it. And even now, I still get chills thinking about it. I don't know what we saw that night. Bigfoot, some kind of animal, a really messed up prank. But whatever it was real. And it scared the hell out of me. I've been debating whether or not I should share this experience for a long time. It's one of those things that still gives me the chills every time I think about it. I worked as a guide in a park near the Great Smoky Mountains a few years back. It was one of those jobs that sounded great on paper. Fresh air, nature, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're a million miles away from civilization. I spent most nights in a small cabin near the edge of the campgrounds, which, to be honest, was pretty isolated. It was peaceful, though, or at least it used to be. It was late October, and the days had started to get shorter, nights longer. I remember one particular night, probably around 1 or 2 in the morning, I was woken up by something strange. At first I wasn't sure if I was still dreaming, but the sound was unmistakable. It was a crying sound, but not just any crying. It was deep, echoing, and weirdly human. There was this tone to it that made me think of a child, or maybe a woman, just sobbing in pain. It came from somewhere deep in the woods, beyond the edge of the clearing where my cabin stood. I got up, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake off the fog of sleep. For a while, I just stood there listening. My first thought was maybe it was an animal. I'd heard the weird calls of coyotes, foxes, and even bobcats in the area, but this didn't sound like any of them. There was something more deliberate, more mournful about it, like someone genuinely crying for help. Part of me thought I should go check it out, but another part of me, the part that was used to being cautious in the middle of the woods at night, told me to stay put. So I did. I waited, listening as the cries seemed to move, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. They echoed, bouncing between the trees, making it impossible to tell exactly where they were coming from. After a while, the crying just stopped. Silence fell over everything, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Eventually I climbed back into bed, though it took me a long time to fall asleep. The next morning, I couldn't shake the unease, so I decided to walk around the area a bit. The air was crisp, and the mist hung low over the forest floor. As I moved towards the back edge of the clearing, something caught my eye. There, in the soft earth, were footprints. Not the kind you'd expect from an animal. These were big, I mean really big, bigger than any boot print I'd ever seen, and they were spaced far apart, like whatever made them had a huge stride. The toes were clear, not like a boot, but more like a foot, with deep indentations where each toe must have been. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear, but bears don't leave prints like that, and the shape was just wrong. They led from the edge of the forest across the clearing and then disappeared into the woods on the other side. It was like something had come right up to the cabin and then turned back. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild after hearing those cries last night. The day went by as usual. A few hikers came through, and I did my job, guiding them along the trails, making sure everyone was safe. By the time night fell again, I'd almost managed to convince myself that the footprints and the crying were unrelated, that I was overthinking everything. But deep down, I still felt that gnawing unease. That night, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't the crying that woke me. It was a noise right outside the cabin. It sounded like something brushing against the walls, a kind of soft thud, followed by a dragging noise. My heart started pounding in my chest. I reached for my flashlight, my hands trembling, and shone it towards the window. The beam cut through the darkness, but all I could see were the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. I took a deep breath and decided to step outside. I don't know why. Maybe I just needed to prove to myself that there was nothing there. I opened the door slowly, the hinges creaking in the silence of the night. The air was cold, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. I shone the flashlight around, and that's when I saw it. The fence that ran along the edge of the clearing, just a few yards from the cabin, was broken. Not just broken, but smashed, like something had barreled right through it. The wood splintered outwards, pieces scattered across the ground. I felt that chill again, the one that started in my stomach and worked its way up my spine. I moved the light towards the small storage shed where we kept supplies. Canned food, firewood, basic stuff. The door was open, swinging on its hinges, and inside, everything was in disarray. Cans were scattered across the floor, and the firewood was knocked over, some pieces broken in half. It looked like something had ransacked the place. I backed up, my hands shaking, and quickly went back inside the cabin, bolting the door behind me. I barely slept that night. Every sound, every creak of the cabin settling, every rustle of leaves outside made my heart leap into my throat. I kept the flashlight clutched in my hand until the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees. The next day, I reported what I'd seen to my supervisor. He nodded, but I could tell he didn't really believe me. He said it was probably a bear, maybe a black bear that had wandered too close looking for food. But I knew it wasn't a bear. I'd seen bears before, and this felt different. The footprints, the crying, the way the fence was smashed, it all felt deliberate. Like something, or someone, was trying to get my attention. The following nights were worse. The crying came back, only this time it was closer. It started just after sunset, echoing through the trees, and each night it seemed to move closer and closer to the cabin. I would lie in bed, every muscle in my body tense, just listening. There was a pattern to it. It would start far off, then grow louder, closer, until it felt like it was right outside. But whenever I gathered the courage to look, there was nothing there. One night, the crying was so close, I swore it was right by the window. I didn't dare move. I didn't even breathe. I just lay there, listening, feeling the tears well up in my eyes from sheer terror. The crying went on for what felt like hours, a mournful wailing that seemed to vibrate through the walls of the cabin. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse, like the whole world had gone still. I knew I couldn't stay there anymore. I wasn't sleeping. I was constantly on edge, and I felt like I was losing my mind. I put in a request for a transfer the very next morning. My supervisor looked at me like I was being overly dramatic, but I didn't care. I needed to get out of there. On my last night in the cabin, I packed up all my things, ready to leave at first light. I tried to sleep, but of course the crying came back. This time, though, there was something different about it. It wasn't just crying anymore. There was a kind of low growl underneath it, a rumble that seemed to shake the very ground. I squeezed my eyes shut, clutching my blanket, praying for it to stop. And then, just like that, it did. I waited, my ears straining for any sound, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no rustling, just silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I grabbed my bags and left without looking back. To this day, I have no idea what it was. I've read stories, heard people talk about strange things in the woods, creatures, spirits, things that can't be explained. I'm not saying I know what I heard or saw, but I know it wasn't a bear. It wasn't any animal I'd ever encountered. Sometimes I think about those footprints, the crying, the way it all seemed so deliberate, like something was trying to lure me out into the woods. I don't work as a guide anymore. I moved to a city, far away from the mountains, far away from the woods. I still love nature, but there's a part of me that will never feel comfortable being alone in the wilderness again. Whatever it was, it's still out there, and I have no intention of ever finding out what it wanted. I've never shared this before, mostly because people tend to roll their eyes or make jokes when you mention something like Bigfoot or anything even remotely strange. But the thing is, I can't unsee what I saw that night. It still feels raw whenever I think about it, and to be honest, I haven't gone back to that place since. I'm hoping writing it down will help me make sense of it, or at least put some of those memories to rest. So here it goes, my story about what happened under that old railway bridge in Alabama. It was a late summer evening, one of those days when the heat starts to fade as the sun dips behind the tree line, and a slight breeze finally gives you a reason to breathe deep. My son Jacob and I had decided to go fishing in a small creek that ran below an old, almost forgotten railway bridge just a bit outside our town. This was the kind of place that most people would pass by without even noticing, just a narrow dirt path that wound off the main road, leading down to the water, mostly hidden by the dense Alabama woods. I remember Jacob being excited. He's 10, and at that age everything's still an adventure. I figured this was a good chance to bond with him, away from his video games, just the two of us, with nothing but the water and the woods. We parked the truck a little ways from the creek and walked down the embankment with our rods, bait, and a small cooler. There's something about that place, quiet, almost too quiet, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. But at the time I didn't think much of it. It was just us, the crickets, and the occasional call of a bird. We settled in close to the creek, right under the shadow of that old railway bridge. I remember looking up at it. The thing looked ancient, covered in rust and half swallowed by ivy, with some of the wood planks missing. The idea that a train could still pass over it seemed ridiculous, but the tracks were still there, so who knows? We cast our lines into the water, and Jacob was laughing about something, probably my lousy casting skills, when it all started. It was subtle at first, a sound that made me pause, like something shifting in the woods. I brushed it off, just a deer or maybe a raccoon, but then it got louder. Heavy footsteps, not the light tread of an animal, but something deliberate, like someone, or something, was making its way towards the bridge above us. I could feel the weight of every step, the way the old wooden planks creaked under the pressure. It wasn't like the sound of a person walking either. There was this odd rhythm to it, slow but heavy, almost as if each step required effort. I looked up, squinting against the dim light, and that's when I saw it. A tall, dark figure moving across the bridge. My first thought was that it was a person, maybe a homeless guy or some thrill-seeker trying to cross that old structure for fun. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized this wasn't a person. It was too big. The figure moved slowly, almost deliberately, like it was aware of us and didn't care. I could see the outline, broad shoulders, long arms that seemed to swing low, a head that sat squarely on top without much of a neck. And it was covered in something dark, maybe fur or hair. The more I looked, the more I realized how wrong everything about it was. Jacob hadn't noticed it yet. He was busy untangling his line, oblivious to what was happening above us. I tried to stay calm, but there was this growing knot of fear in my chest, like my body knew before my mind did that something was very, very wrong. I nudged Jacob, whispering for him to look up, and when he did, I heard his breath catch. He looked at me, his eyes wide, and I could see the confusion, the fear starting to set in. The thing, whatever it was, kept moving across the bridge, and then it stopped, right above us. It just stood there, like it knew we were watching. I swear I could feel its eyes on us, even though I couldn't make out any details from where we were. The air felt thick, like the whole world had gone silent. Even the crickets had stopped chirping. All I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat, thudding in my ears. I'm not proud of what I did next, but instinct took over. I told Jacob, as calmly as I could manage, to start packing up. My hands were shaking as I gathered our stuff, shoving everything back into the cooler without caring about organizing it. Jacob was silent, his eyes darting back and forth between me and the figure above. I could tell he was scared, but he was trying to be brave, trying not to cry. Just as we were about to move, we heard it, a low, almost guttural sound, like a growl but deeper, resonating through the air. It wasn't an animal noise. I've spent enough time in the woods to know the sounds that animals make. This was different, almost like it was trying to communicate, to warn us. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I grabbed Jacob's hand and we started moving, trying to make our way up the embankment as fast as we could without breaking into a full-blown run. The path back to the truck felt a mile long. Every step we took, I expected to hear it following us, to feel those heavy footsteps shaking the ground behind us. I kept glancing over my shoulder, and that's when I saw it again. It had moved off the bridge, down the other side, and now stood at the edge, just watching us. I could see it more clearly now, tall, easily over 7 feet, with long, matted hair covering its body. Its eyes caught the faint bit of moonlight that had started to filter through the trees, and for a split second I saw them, dark, almost reflective, like the eyes of a predator. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I practically shoved Jacob into the truck, fumbling with the keys, my hands slick with sweat. The engine roared to life and I threw the truck into reverse, kicking up gravel as we sped away. In the rearview mirror, I caught one last glimpse of the bridge, and there it was, still standing there, still watching us. It didn't move, didn't chase us. It just watched until the trees swallowed it from view. We didn't speak on the drive home. Jacob was pale, his eyes wide, and I could tell he was trying to process what we'd just seen. I didn't have any answers for him. Hell, I didn't have any answers for myself. What the hell was that thing? Why was it there? And why did it feel like it was watching us specifically? I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head, and nothing makes sense. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person. It was something else. Something that shouldn't exist, but does. I haven't been back to that creek since, and I don't think I ever will. Even now, months later, I still get chills thinking about it. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I'll hear that low, guttural sound in my head, and it'll all come rushing back. The heavy footsteps, the feeling of being watched, the sheer wrongness of it all. I know people will say I imagined it, or that it was just an animal, and my mind played tricks on me. But I know what I saw, and I know that whatever it was real. Jacob doesn't talk about it much, but I can tell it affected him too. He's not as eager to go fishing anymore, and he avoids the woods, even during the day. I guess that's the part that bothers me the most. The fact that something out there, something I can't explain, took away a piece of my son's innocence. I hate that he had to see it, that he had to feel that kind of fear at such a young age. I don't know if anyone else has experienced anything like this in that area. I haven't heard any stories, but then again, who would talk about it? Who would believe it? All I know is that I'm not going back, and if you ever find yourself near an old railway bridge in the woods of Alabama, do yourself a favor, keep moving. There's something out there, something that watches, something that waits. And trust me, you don't want to meet it. I'm not usually the kind of guy who shares stuff like this online. I'm not a storyteller, and honestly, I'm still trying to wrap my head around what happened that night. But there's something about putting it out there that makes me think maybe someone else will understand, maybe even help me make sense of it. Anyway, here goes. A couple of years ago, I was living up in the northern part of California. Rural area, pretty isolated. It's beautiful out there. Dense forests, clear streams, and most importantly, a lot of quiet. I was renting this small, single-story house that had a pretty big backyard, bordering right on the edge of a thick tree line. My closest neighbor, Richard, lived about a quarter-mile down the road. For context, Richard was this old-timer, been in that house for almost 30 years. He knew the area better than anyone. One day, Richard came over to talk to me about something weird going on with his garden. He looked a bit unsettled, which was out of character for him. He was a tough old guy, you know. Not the kind of person to get spooked easily. He said something, or someone, had been messing with his vegetable garden at night. Tomatoes crushed, corn stalks snapped clean in half, some of the fencing torn out of the ground. He thought maybe it was some teenagers screwing around, or maybe even a bear. He asked if I could help keep watch one night, just in case. I figured, why not? I didn't have much else going on, and I liked Richard. So a couple nights later, I grabbed a lawn chair, a flashlight, and my old hunting rifle, not loaded, just for show, and headed over to Richard's place around dusk. We set up near his garden, which was tucked behind his house, bordering the forest. There was this patch of squash and tomatoes closest to the woods, and you could tell something had really done a number on it. Big footprints, bigger than any boot I'd ever seen. Richard was saying maybe it was a black bear, but honestly, the prints didn't look like that to me. Too long, almost human-like, but massive. We sat out there for a few hours, just chatting quietly, listening to the forest. The crickets were loud, and the occasional rustling in the underbrush kept us on our toes, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Richard eventually went inside around 11 p.m., said he'd try to catch some sleep, and that I could wake him if anything happened. I stayed put, determined to help him figure out what was going on. It was past midnight when things got strange. The crickets, which had been this constant background noise, just stopped. Dead silent. It was like someone flipped a switch. I remember thinking that was odd, but before I could really react, I heard this heavy crunching sound coming from the woods. Not like a deer stepping on a branch, something bigger, heavier, the kind of weight that makes the ground almost vibrate beneath you. I switched off my flashlight and tried to stay as still as possible, peering into the darkness. Then I saw it. It stepped out of the tree line, moving slowly, almost deliberately, into Richard's garden. It was tall, way taller than any person I'd ever seen. Had to be at least 7 or 8 feet, covered in dark, matted hair that seemed to blend into the shadows. For a second, I genuinely thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. It moved in this strangely fluid way, like it was completely at home there, among the vegetables, bending down and sniffing the air like it was searching for something. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. I tried to make sense of what I was seeing, some weird kind of bear, maybe. But no, the shape was wrong. The way it moved was wrong. It had these long arms that almost dangled past its knees, and the face, I could barely make it out in the dark, but it looked disturbingly human-like, just wrong. Almost like a distorted mask of what a person should look like. It picked up one of Richard's squash, sniffed it, and just crushed it in one hand, like it was nothing. I didn't know what to do. I was frozen. I knew I had the rifle, but the idea of aiming at that thing made me feel like a total idiot. What if it just made it angry? Then, as if it sensed me, it turned its head slowly, and that's when I felt this rush of pure, cold fear. It was looking directly at me. I'll never forget those eyes, reflecting the faintest bit of moonlight. They weren't animal eyes. They looked intelligent, like it was sizing me up, deciding if I was a threat. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but in reality, it must have been only a few seconds. My whole body was trembling, and all I could think was, "Please, just go. Please don't come any closer." And then, almost as if it heard me, it slowly turned away, dropped the squash, and walked back into the forest, disappearing into the darkness. The crickets didn't start back up for what felt like another 10 minutes. I just sat there, heart racing, gripping that useless rifle like it was my lifeline. I didn't wake Richard. I didn't even move until the first hint of dawn started to break. When I finally got up, my legs were so stiff I could barely walk back to my house. I never told Richard what I saw. He asked if anything happened, and I just shook my head, said it was probably just a deer or something. But I think he knew I was lying. There was something in the way he looked at me, this quiet understanding, like maybe he'd seen something too once upon a time, but didn't want to talk about it. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, somewhere in those woods, watching. I'd catch myself staring out my back window at the tree line, half expecting to see those eyes again, just waiting. I started sleeping less and less, every creak of the house making my skin crawl. I knew it was irrational, but I couldn't help it. The fear just wouldn't go away. A few months later, I decided to move. I told people it was for work, or that I wanted to be closer to family, but the truth is, I just couldn't stay. Not knowing that thing was out there, that it could come back any time it wanted. Even now, living hours away, I still sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, convinced I heard something heavy moving outside my window. I've tried to rationalize it 100 different ways. Maybe it was a bear with some kind of disease. Maybe I was half asleep and imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I know what I saw. I know it was real. And the worst part is, I'll probably never understand what it was or why it was there. It's just something I have to live with now. If you've ever seen something like that, I guess you understand. And if you haven't, well, I hope you never do. Because that feeling, the feeling of being watched by something that shouldn't exist, it sticks with you. It's the kind of fear that doesn't go away, no matter how far you run. I've always been the type of person who loves being out in nature. Growing up, I was a scout myself, and eventually I became a scout leader. I loved it, the fresh air, the camaraderie, the sense of adventure. I never thought I'd have any reason to be afraid of the woods, but after what happened that night, I've never looked at the forest in quite the same way. This happened a few years ago during a camping trip with a group of scouts. We were in Idaho, out in a pretty isolated spot. We'd picked it because it was far enough from any towns or main roads to give the kids that real wilderness experience. It was my job to make sure everything went smoothly, and up until that night, it really had. The kids were having a blast, roasting marshmallows, telling ghost stories by the fire, hiking during the day. It was one of those perfect camping trips, you know. The day had been exhausting in the best way possible. We'd spent hours hiking along a riverbed, and by the time the sun started to set, everyone was ready for a good night's sleep. We put out the campfire, made sure everything was packed away, and headed to our tents. I remember sitting outside for a while, watching the stars come out, enjoying the quiet. It was just me and the sounds of the woods, the rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. Nothing felt off at all, not yet. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. It wasn't one of the kids calling out, no sounds from any of the tents, just a strange feeling that something wasn't quite right. Then I heard it, the snap of a branch. I tried to tell myself it was probably just a deer, but something about the heaviness of the sound made me hesitate. It wasn't just the sound of a small animal moving through the woods. It was heavy, deliberate. I sat up and grabbed my flashlight, quietly unzipping my tent. I wanted to see what it was without waking up the others, especially the kids. I didn't want to freak them out over nothing. Slowly, I stuck my head out, and immediately I saw a shadow moving between the trees. My heart stopped for a second. It was tall, really tall, much taller than a person should be. The shape was just a dark silhouette, but it moved with purpose, almost like it knew I was there but didn't care. It was keeping a distance, moving along the edge of our camp. I remember trying to rationalize it in my head. My first thought was, maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs. But bears don't move like that, not that smoothly, and they don't watch people like this thing seemed to be watching. It stayed just far enough away that I couldn't make out any details, and every once in a while it would stop, almost like it was listening or waiting. I must have sat there, frozen, for what felt like forever. I didn't move, barely breathed, just watched as this thing moved in and out of the shadows. I could see the silhouette, broad shoulders, a head that seemed to blend into the body, and the sheer size of it. It wasn't a person. It couldn't be a person. Every now and then, I'd hear the crunch of a branch underfoot, and it sounded so heavy. I had this horrible feeling that if I turned my flashlight on and pointed it at the figure, I'd see something I could never unsee, something that would terrify the kids if they ever knew it was out there with us. I stayed put, watching, my heart pounding so loudly I was scared it would wake the others. I debated waking up one of the other adults, but I didn't want to draw attention to it. If it hadn't come closer yet, maybe it would leave us alone. I tried to convince myself it would just go away, and eventually it did. It moved back into the woods, and soon the sounds faded until there was nothing but the usual rustling and chirping. I stayed up the rest of the night, flashlight in hand, listening for any hint that it might come back. I couldn't sleep, not with the idea that something that large was out there, just watching us. When dawn finally started breaking, I let out a breath I didn't even realize I'd been holding. Once the sun was up and the kids were waking, I got out of my tent. I made an effort to act like everything was normal, but inside, I was on edge, scanning the tree line. That's when I saw them. Huge footprints, right along the edge of the camp, just where I'd seen the figure moving. They were spaced far apart, and each one was massive, much larger than any human footprint. I remember crouching down, running my fingers along the edges of one of them, and the feeling of dread just settled into my stomach like a rock. Whatever I had seen wasn't my imagination. I decided not to say anything to the kids. They were already excited about breakfast and starting another day of adventure, and I didn't want to scare them. But as the other adults came out of their tents, I pulled one of them aside and showed them the prints. They looked at me, then at the woods, and I could tell they were just as unsettled as I was. We didn't know what to do. I mean, what do you do in a situation like that? There wasn't exactly a manual for dealing with whatever the hell that thing was. We ended up deciding to cut the trip a little short. We made up some excuse about the weather forecast and needing to leave early. The kids were disappointed, but they didn't question it too much. I think deep down, I was relieved. I didn't want to spend another night out there. I didn't want to risk whatever it was coming back. I've replayed that night over and over in my head 1,000 times since then. I've tried to come up with some kind of rational explanation, something that makes sense, but I always come up empty. It wasn't an animal, at least not any animal I've ever heard of, and it sure as hell wasn't a person. The way it moved, the way it seemed to just watch us, it was like it had intelligence, but not in a comforting way, more like it was sizing us up, deciding whether we were worth the effort. I haven't been back to that spot since. I've taken the scouts on other camping trips, but always to more populated areas, places where we weren't completely isolated. I never told the kids what I saw, and I doubt I ever will. They deserve to keep their love of the woods, untainted by whatever it was that I saw that night. But I still think about it, especially when I'm alone in the woods and the sun starts to dip below the horizon. Sometimes I catch myself listening for that same heavy step, for the crunch of a branch, and I wonder if maybe it's still out there, somewhere, watching. So, I've been wanting to share something that happened to me a few years ago, but every time I think about it, I get this knot in my stomach. This isn't the kind of story you tell to impress people at a campfire or for a bit of fun. It's something that to this day makes me question what, or who, might be lurking in the woods when we're not looking. Anyway, here goes. It happened one winter, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. My dad has this old hunting cabin out in Kentucky, somewhere deep in the woods. It's one of those places that feels 1,000,000 miles away from civilization. I used to go there during the winter, mostly for some peace and quiet, just to clear my head, you know? The kind of isolation you can only get when you're completely cut off. No phone service, no internet. Just you, the wind in the trees, and the occasional rustling of whatever animals were roaming around. I remember that day clearly. It had been a cold one, bitterly cold, the kind that bites through your jacket no matter how many layers you put on. I got to the cabin just as the sun was setting. Everything was covered in this layer of frost, and it made everything feel strangely still, quiet, almost too quiet. I'm used to the silence out there, but this time it was like even the forest was holding its breath. Anyway, I got inside, started a fire in the old stone fireplace, and settled down with a cup of coffee. The cabin has these huge windows in the main room, which give you a full view of the tree line. Beautiful during the day, but once the sun goes down, they start to feel like big, dark voids, the kind that makes you feel like something out there might be watching. I tried not to think about it, and just focused on getting warm. It must have been around 11 p.m. when I first heard it. A loud bang, like something heavy hitting metal. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. Sounded like it came from the direction of the shed, maybe 50 yards away from the cabin. I brushed it off at first, thinking it might have been a tree branch falling, but then it happened again. Another loud crash, followed by a scraping sound. I knew it wasn't a branch. It was too deliberate, too purposeful. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to grab my flashlight and head out to check it out. I remember stepping onto the porch, and the air was so cold it hurt to breathe. My boots crunched on the frozen ground as I moved toward the shed. I was halfway there when I saw it, and honestly I wish I hadn't. Standing there, In the dim beam of my flashlight was this creature. It was massive, maybe 8 or 9 feet tall, and built like a wall. Its body was covered in dark, matted fur, and it was hunched over the shed, pulling at the wooden fence my dad had put up around it years ago. The thing was just ripping it apart, like it was nothing. The weirdest part was, it didn't look like it was trying to get in. It just seemed pissed off, like the fence itself was an annoyance. I must have made a noise, or maybe it just sensed me, but suddenly it stopped what it was doing and turned its head. The light caught its eyes, these deep, dark eyes that seemed almost human but not quite. There was something else there, something that made my blood run cold. And then it let out this low, rumbling growl that I felt more than heard, like it reverberated right in my chest. I didn't think. I just turned and bolted back to the cabin, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I slammed the door shut behind me, locked it, and then locked every other door and window I could find. I remember standing there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the flashlight. The silence that followed was almost worse than the growl. I kept waiting, hoping that whatever it was had just gone back into the woods. But then came the footsteps, heavy, deliberate. They started somewhere around the shed, then moved toward the cabin, circling it. I could hear them crunching in the frozen snow, slow and steady, like it was just taking its time, trying to figure me out. Sometimes it would stop, and I'd hold my breath, straining to hear. Then, after what felt like forever, it would start again, always circling, always just out of sight. At one point, I heard a thud against the side of the cabin, like something was testing the walls. The growls started again too, low and guttural, echoing in the stillness of the night. I remember just sitting there, on the floor of the cabin, the fire crackling behind me, clutching an old hunting rifle my dad kept there. I don't even know if I would have had the nerve to use it. I felt so helpless, like a kid hiding from a monster under the bed. The noises went on for hours. I don't know how long exactly. Time seemed to stretch out forever in that darkness. There were moments when everything would go quiet, and I'd start to think maybe it was gone, only for the footsteps to start up again, closer this time. I was terrified that any second I'd see its face staring through one of those big windows, or hear it trying to break the door down. But it never did. Eventually, sometime before dawn, the noises stopped, just like that. One moment it was there, and the next, nothing. I stayed awake until the first light of morning started to creep in through the windows, too scared to move, too scared to even look outside. When the sun finally came up, I mustered the courage to crack the door open and look out. The shed was a mess, the fence around it torn to pieces, parts of the wood splintered like they'd been struck with a sledgehammer. The ground around the cabin was covered in huge footprints, each one easily twice the size of my own boot. They led off into the woods, disappearing between the trees. I don't know why, but I felt like whatever it was done with me, like it had made its point. I packed up my things, got in my truck, and drove away without looking back. I haven't been back to that cabin since, and I don't plan to. My dad still goes out there every now and then, but I never told him what happened. I don't think he'd believe me anyway. Sometimes I'll catch myself wondering what I saw that night, if it was real, or if my mind was just playing tricks on me in the dark. But then I remember those footprints, the sound of the footsteps circling the cabin, and I know that whatever it wasn't just in my head. I don't know what that creature was, and honestly, I don't want to know. All I know is that something's out there in those woods, something big, and it's not afraid of us. The memory still haunts me, and every time winter rolls around, I can't help but think back to that night and wonder, is it still out there, somewhere in those woods, waiting? I don't really know where to start. This is something I've never fully come to terms with, and I still get chills whenever I even think about that night. Honestly, I hesitated a lot before writing this down because, well, I'm afraid people will just think I'm making it all up, or that it was my imagination playing tricks on me. But every time I remember what happened, it feels so real, too real. Anyway, I decided to share it because maybe someone else has gone through something like this too. Maybe I'm not alone. It was a few years ago, but the memory of that night is still so vivid. I swear I can even remember the smell of the damp leaves and the chill of the mountain air. I was driving on this winding mountain road in West Virginia. It was already late, and I know I shouldn't have been out there by myself, but I'd been visiting my friend who lived a bit off the grid, and I lost track of time. So there I was, trying to get back home in the dark, with only my headlights cutting through the emptiness. If you've ever driven through those mountain roads at night, you know how eerie it can be. No streetlights, barely any signs, and just the dark forest closing in on both sides. It felt like I was the only person left in the world. The car, an old Toyota that had seen better days, started making this weird rattling noise. My heart sank a bit because I knew something was off, but I hoped it was nothing major. A few minutes later, the engine sputtered, and then the car just died. The lights flickered and went out, and I was left sitting in almost complete darkness. The only light came from the moon, which wasn't much, and the faint glow of my hazard lights. It was dead silent. No cars, no wind, just the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I tried to start the car again, but it wouldn't even turn over. Great. Stuck in the middle of nowhere. I called the tow company and tried to stay calm while explaining where I was. They said it would be at least an hour before someone could get to me. I hung up and sat there, trying to convince myself it wasn't as bad as it seemed. But the more I looked out into the dark trees, the more I felt like something was off. I've never been the paranoid type, but there was something about that silence. It felt heavy, like I was being watched, like the forest itself was holding its breath. At first I thought it was just my imagination, you know? You hear a noise, and suddenly you're convinced there's something out there. But this wasn't just a noise. I heard something moving, a rustling sound like branches snapping underfoot. It was subtle at first, and I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was probably just an animal. Maybe a deer, maybe even a raccoon. But the sound kept getting closer, not hurried but deliberate. And it was coming from the forest, just to the right of my car. I remember turning my head slowly, feeling my chest tighten as I strained my eyes to see past the trees. At first I saw nothing, just shadows shifting, branches swaying slightly in the breeze. But then I saw it. There was a shape, something tall, and it was moving. I could barely make it out at first, but it stepped closer, just at the edge of where my headlights had died. It was massive, tall, covered in dark hair, with these eyes that, I swear, reflected the light from my hazards in a way that didn't feel natural. They had this eerie, glowing quality, almost like an animal caught in a flashlight beam, but more intense, like they were staring right into me. I froze. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles went white. I didn't even breathe. The creature just stood there, half in the shadows, half out. It was like it was watching me, sizing me up. I couldn't make out its face in detail, but I could see the outline of its head, broad shoulders, and the way it seemed to almost blend into the forest. It wasn't human, not even close. But it also wasn't like any animal I'd ever seen. It had this presence, this intelligence behind its eyes that made my stomach twist with fear. It felt like hours, but it must have only been a few seconds. The thing just stood there, and I swear I could hear it breathing, this low, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the air. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I didn't know what to do. I was trapped. If I got out of the car, I'd be running straight into the woods, and there was no way I was doing that. But staying put felt just as terrifying because I had no idea what this thing was going to do next. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it turned. It moved back into the shadows, almost gliding, barely making a sound despite its size. I watched, my eyes wide, as it disappeared into the darkness of the forest, and the rustling faded until there was nothing but silence again. I was shaking all over, my hands still glued to the wheel. I remember thinking, did that really just happen? But the fear was so real, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. I kept staring into the trees, half expecting it to come back, to charge at the car or something, but it didn't. It was just gone. After what felt like an eternity, I saw the tow truck's headlights coming up the road. I have never been so relieved to see another person in my entire life. The guy got out, and I remember almost stumbling out of the car to meet him. He must have thought I was a complete mess. I couldn't even find the words to explain what I'd seen. I just kept looking back at the tree line, expecting those eyes to appear again. The driver asked if I was okay, and I nodded, but I must have looked pale as a ghost. I didn't tell him about the creature. I mean, what was I supposed to say? Hey, I just saw Bigfoot. I didn't want him to think I was crazy. The rest of the night was a blur. He hooked up my car, and I got into the cab of the tow truck, my eyes darting back to the woods the entire time. Even as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing eyes staring back at me. Since that night, I've avoided that road. I don't care if it takes me an extra hour to get around. I'm not driving through those mountains after dark ever again. I've tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just a bear or maybe even a trick of the light. But deep down I know it wasn't. There was something out there, something that wasn't supposed to be. And it saw me. I still don't know what it was. I've read stories, seen documentaries about sightings, but nothing quite captures the feeling of actually being there, of seeing something that you can't explain staring right back at you. It changed something in me. I used to love going for hikes, camping, being out in nature. But now, I can't shake the feeling that we're not alone out there, that there are things in the woods we don't understand, things that are better left alone. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Honestly, if someone else told me this story, I don't know if I would believe them either. But I know what I saw, and I know I'll never forget those eyes, glowing in the dark, watching me from the edge of the trees. It's something that's going to stay with me for the rest of my life. I don't usually share stories like this, but it's been eating at me for a while now, and I figured putting it out there might help me make sense of it, or at least get it off my chest. I know how it sounds, and if someone else was telling me this, I'd probably roll my eyes too. But I swear this is what happened, and I'm just hoping that maybe someone out there has experienced something similar. This all started about a year ago on my little farm in Ohio. I retired from farming years back, but I've still got a patch of corn growing out back. Keeps me busy, gives me something to do, you know? Anyway, it was around late summer when I started noticing something strange going on. Every morning, a section of my cornfield looked like it had been trampled, and I'd find a few ears of corn half chewed, scattered all over the ground. At first, I figured it was deer. We get plenty of wildlife out here, and it wouldn't be the first time I had to chase them away. But this was different. The damage was bigger, like something much heavier had been plowing through my field. After a few nights of finding my crop destroyed, I decided I'd had enough. I'm an old guy, but I'm not one to let things slide easily, especially when it comes to something I worked hard on. So one evening, I grabbed my old rifle and a lawn chair, set myself up on the edge of the field, and waited. The night was quiet, Ohio quiet. You could hear the wind rustling the corn, the distant hum of cicadas, and the occasional rustle of some critter moving through the brush. I sat there for hours, my hands wrapped around the rifle more for comfort than anything else. I wasn't planning on using it unless I absolutely had to. It must have been close to midnight when I finally heard something. It started as a soft rustle, but it grew louder. Something big was moving through the corn. My heart started pounding, and I strained my eyes in the dark, trying to make out any movement. For a while it was just the sound, getting closer and closer, and I kept thinking, this is it, just a big deer. Maybe a black bear wandered down. But then I saw it, and I knew right away that this was no deer. The thing stepped out from between the rows of corn, and I swear to you, it was taller than any man I'd ever seen, easily over 7 feet. It was covered in thick, dark fur, and it moved with this strange sort of grace, like it was completely at home in the dark. I could see its long arms reach out, grabbing ears of corn and snapping them off like they were nothing. It wasn't in a rush. It moved slowly, almost deliberately, and I just sat there, frozen. I had my rifle, but I couldn't bring myself to raise it. I was terrified, but it wasn't just fear. There was something else, something about the way it moved that told me this thing wasn't just some wild animal. There was an intelligence to it. I don't know how long I sat there just watching. It felt like forever, but it was probably only a few minutes. The creature didn't seem to notice me, or maybe it just didn't care. It kept moving through the corn, tearing off ears, chewing on them, and tossing the rest aside. I remember the sound of it chewing, this wet, crunching noise that seemed to echo in the stillness of the night. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped the rifle, and I kept thinking, "Don't move, don't breathe, just let it leave." Eventually it did. It turned slowly and walked back into the field, disappearing between the tall stalks like it had never been there at all. I waited until I couldn't hear it anymore, until the rustling faded back into the regular sounds of the night. And then I ran. I'm not ashamed to say it. I ran back to the house as fast as my old legs would carry me. I slammed the door behind me, locked it, and sat in the kitchen for a long time, just trying to calm myself down. The next morning I went out to the field. Part of me hoped that maybe I'd dreamed it, that it was all just some kind of weird nightmare. But when I got out there, I saw the damage. The corn was trampled, the ears were missing or left half-eaten, just like before. But this time, there were tracks. Big ones. They were too large to be human, and they had this strange shape, almost like a footprint, but wider, with toes that dug deep into the dirt. I stood there for a long time, staring at those tracks, feeling that same fear from the night before creeping back in. I told my family about it later that day. I knew how it would sound, and sure enough, they didn't believe me. My son laughed it off, said it was probably just a bear or maybe some prankster messing with me. My daughter looked concerned, but I could tell she thought I'd just imagined it. I can't blame them, honestly. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't have believed it either. But I know what I saw, and I know it wasn't any bear. I haven't gone back out to the field at night since then. I still tend to the corn during the day, but as soon as the sun starts to set, I head inside. I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, somewhere in the woods, watching. Sometimes, late at night, I'll hear something outside, a rustle, a strange noise carried on the wind, and I'll lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, telling myself it's just my imagination. But deep down, I know it's not. Whatever that thing was, it's still out there, and I have no intention of running into it again. I've thought about setting up cameras, trying to get proof, but honestly, I don't know if I want to see it again. Part of me thinks that maybe it's better to just leave it alone, to pretend that it was all just a bad dream. But every time I look at that patch of corn, I'm reminded that it was real. I've lived on this land my whole life, and I've never seen anything like that before. I don't know what it was, and I don't think I ever will. All I know is that something big and something not quite right came onto my land that night, and I'm not sure it's ever really left. I guess I'm sharing this because I want to know if anyone else has seen something like this. I've heard stories over the years, of course. People talk about strange sightings, creatures out in the woods that nobody can explain. But it always felt like just that. Stories. Until now. Now, I'm not so sure. I keep replaying that night in my head, wondering if there was something I could have done differently, if maybe I should have tried to get a picture or make some noise to scare it off. But in that moment, all I could think about was staying as still as possible and hoping it would go away. There's a part of me that wonders if it will come back. The corn's almost ready for harvest again, and I've caught myself looking out at the field more often, watching for any sign of movement. I don't know what I'll do if I see it again. Maybe this time I'll be ready. Or maybe I'll just turn around, go back inside and lock the door, like I did before. Sometimes I think that's the smartest thing anyone can do when faced with something like that. Just walk away and hope it walks away too. Anyway, that's my story. I'm not looking for answers, really. I don't think there are any. But if you've seen something like this, if you felt that same kind of fear, I'd like to know. It'd be nice to hear I'm not the only one. I've always been a hiking enthusiast. You know, one of those people who'd rather spend a weekend covered in bug spray and sweating on a trail than just relaxing at home. It's always been my way to recharge. Nature has this weird way of putting things in perspective. The vastness of it makes my everyday worries feel so tiny. So, about a year ago, I decided to spend a weekend solo camping in one of the lesser-known trails of a national park here in Washington state. That weekend has haunted me ever since, and honestly, I haven't gone hiking alone since then. It started out as one of those picture-perfect days. I'd picked a trail that was a bit off the beaten path, which meant fewer people, just how I liked it. My goal was to hike in about 10 miles, set up camp, and then maybe explore a bit more after that. Everything went smoothly. I hiked in, found this beautiful clearing by a stream, and set up my tent. The place was gorgeous, and I barely saw anyone else during the entire hike. There were maybe 2 people the whole day, and they were going the opposite direction. By late afternoon, I had set up camp, made myself some instant noodles, and just sat there with my back against a tree, listening to the sounds of the forest. Everything felt so peaceful. The birds were chirping, and there was a breeze rustling through the branches. You know, the kind of sounds that just make you feel small but safe. I was completely content. The sun started dipping below the horizon, and the temperature dropped, so I decided to get into my tent and read for a while before going to sleep. I must have dozed off around 9, maybe 10, who knows. But at some point in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. It wasn't like I drifted awake naturally. No, it was more like my senses knew something was off before my brain did. Everything was dead silent, like unnaturally silent. If you've spent time in the woods, you know there's almost always some noise, wind, insects, distant animal calls, whatever. But there was nothing. The air was thick, like it was pressing down on me. Then I heard it, a deep, rhythmic thudding sound. It was faint at first, but as I became more awake, I realized it was getting closer. It sounded like someone, or something, was hitting a tree with something heavy. Thump, thump, thump. The noise was slow, almost deliberate, and it echoed through the trees. I tried telling myself it was just a woodpecker, or maybe some animal scratching against a tree, but it didn't match. The noise was too heavy, too deep, like someone was slamming a log against a tree trunk. My heart started to pound, and I tried to ignore the rising panic. I unzipped my sleeping bag as quietly as I could, straining my ears to figure out which direction the sound was coming from. I just sat there for what felt like an eternity, listening. The noise was so close now that I could almost feel it. And then it stopped. Dead silence again. I held my breath, trying to hear anything at all, but it was just nothing. My heart was in my throat, and I tried to convince myself to stay calm, that I was overreacting, but then I heard footsteps. Not human footsteps either. These were heavy, deliberate. It sounded like something big was walking just outside my tent. I felt paralyzed. I didn't know if I should move or make noise or stay quiet. My gut told me not to do anything that would draw attention, so I just stayed as still as possible. The footsteps continued, slow and heavy, circling my camp. I could hear twigs snapping and the sound of something massive, brushing against the undergrowth. Then came the thudding again, and this time it was right outside. I couldn't see what was happening, but I just knew something was there, and it wasn't a bear or any other animal I could think of. With my heart pounding, I mustered the courage to slowly unzip the tent just a tiny bit, enough to peek out. I could barely make anything out, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw it. A figure, massive, maybe 8 or 9 feet tall. It was covered in hair, dark, and it was standing with its back to me, holding this thick branch. It was hitting the tree, thump, thump, like it was making some kind of signal. I felt this wave of dread, something primal, like every part of me was screaming that I shouldn't be there, that I should have never come. I don't think it saw me, or maybe it just didn't care, because after what felt like forever, it started to move away. Slowly, almost lazily, it turned and walked into the woods, still carrying that branch. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, until I couldn't hear it anymore. I wanted to believe I was imagining things, that maybe it was some weird trick of the shadows, but the way it moved, the sound it made, there was nothing natural about it. It felt like I was intruding on something that wasn't meant for me to see. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just sat there in my tent, listening, every tiny rustle making me jump. When the first light of dawn broke, I packed up my stuff as fast as I could. I didn't even bother eating or making coffee. I just shoved everything into my backpack, my hands shaking the entire time. I kept looking around, expecting to see it again, expecting it to come crashing back through the trees. But there was nothing, just the usual sounds of the morning forest, like everything had gone back to normal. The hike back to my car felt endless. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every crunch of leaves under my feet, every snap of a twig made my heart race. I tried to keep my mind on the trail, focus on getting out of there, but I couldn't stop replaying what I'd seen. That figure, the way it moved, the way it seemed to be marking the trees, like it was letting me know this was its territory. I've heard stories about Bigfoot, of course, but I never took them seriously. It's always been something that felt more like a campfire tale than anything real. But now, I don't know. I don't know what I saw, but I know it wasn't normal. When I finally made it to my car, I felt this overwhelming sense of relief. I threw my backpack in, got in the driver's seat, and just sat there for a minute, trying to calm down. My hands were still shaking, and I could barely get the key into the ignition. I drove out of there as fast as I could, not looking back even once. Since that day, I haven't been able to shake the feeling that I was lucky, like whatever was out there decided to let me go. I've gone hiking since then, but never alone. I can't do it. I keep thinking about that silence, that awful heavy silence, and the sound of that branch hitting the tree, echoing in the dark. I don't know if anyone will believe this. Part of me still wonders if I imagined it, if maybe I was just tired and my mind played tricks on me. But it felt real, too real. And even now, whenever I'm out in the woods, I can't help but listen for that sound, that slow, deliberate thump, thump, thump. I haven't heard it again, and I hope I never do. I don't even know why I'm writing this. I guess part of me just needs to get it out, you know. Maybe if I share it, it'll feel a little less real, or maybe it'll make me feel a little less alone, knowing there might be others out there who've seen something similar. Anyway, here's what happened. I run a small pig farm out in Virginia, nothing fancy. Just me, a few acres, and about 30 or so pigs. It's honest work, tiring most of the time, but it pays the bills. Everything was fine until a couple of weeks ago when I started noticing something strange. One morning, I went out to feed the pigs, and I realized one of them was missing. Now, I've dealt with wild animals before, coyotes mostly, but the fencing around the pen is pretty solid, and I didn't see any signs of something breaking in or digging underneath. Just one pig, gone. I figured maybe I'd miscounted. I mean, it happens when you're half asleep at 6 in the morning. But then, 2 nights later, another one was missing. No broken fence, no blood, no signs of a struggle. It was like the damn thing just vanished. That's when I knew something wasn't right. I tried to put it out of my mind, thinking it had to be a fluke, but I couldn't shake this feeling, like there was something watching the farm. It's that kind of unease that sits in your gut and just makes you feel off. I decided to set up one of those hunting cameras, you know, the ones that hunters use to track deer. I put it up on a post near the pig pen, facing the gate. I figured if something was getting in, I'd catch it in the act. The first 2 nights, nothing happened. No missing pigs, no weird noises, nothing. I started to think maybe whatever it was had moved on. But then came that 3rd night. I'll never forget it. I was sitting in the living room just watching TV and trying to wind down. It was about 11 p.m. when I heard the pigs start making this awful noise, squealing like I'd never heard before. Not the usual grunts or even the yelps when they get in little fights. No, this was pure fear. My heart was pounding immediately. I grabbed the flashlight, slipped on my boots and rushed outside. The moment I stepped out onto the porch, I knew something was wrong. The air felt different, heavier, almost electric. The pigs were going nuts, running around in circles, crashing into each other. And then I saw it. A huge figure, easily over 7 feet tall, was standing at the far end of the pen. It had this massive, broad-shouldered shape, covered in dark hair that almost blended in with the night. I stood there, frozen, my brain struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. It reached down into the pen, as effortlessly as you or I would reach into a box, and grabbed one of the pigs. I swear to God, it lifted that 200-pound pig like it was nothing more than a sack of flour. I don't know what I was thinking, but I must have made some noise, maybe a gasp, or I stepped forward without realizing it, because the thing suddenly turned its head toward me. Its eyes caught the light from my flashlight just for a split second, and they glowed this eerie, dull red. That was enough for me. I turned and ran back into the house, slamming the door shut behind me. I stood there, panting, my back against the door, feeling like a complete coward. But there was no way I was going back out there. I could still hear the pigs screaming, and then, just like that, silence. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my kitchen with my shotgun, staring at the back door, listening for anything, any sign that it had come closer. But nothing happened. Eventually I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, it was dawn. When I finally went back outside, I found what I expected. Another pig gone. No signs of a struggle, no blood. Just empty space where there should have been one more animal. I remembered the camera, and my hands were shaking as I took it down and brought it inside. I hooked it up to my computer, and there it was, just like I had seen the night before. The figure, tall, covered in hair, those glowing eyes. It moved so smoothly, like it was used to doing this, like it knew exactly what it was after. I watched the video maybe a dozen times, trying to convince myself that it wasn't real. But it was. Every time I saw it, my stomach dropped all over again. The worst part was that there was no doubt. That thing had looked right at me. It knew I was there, and it didn't care. It took what it wanted and left, like I was nothing. I thought about showing the footage to someone, maybe the police, or even posting it online. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Who would believe me? A farmer claiming to have seen a Bigfoot, or whatever the hell that was, stealing pigs in the dead of night. People would think I was crazy or worse. They'd come snooping around, and I don't want anyone else out here. Not with whatever that thing is still out there. It's been about a week since that night, and I haven't lost any more pigs. But I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. Every night I sit in my living room, lights off, just listening. The pigs have been quieter, but sometimes I think I hear something in the woods. A branch snapping, leaves rustling, and my heart starts pounding all over again. I haven't moved the camera back out there. I don't want to know if it's still coming around. Part of me thinks maybe if I leave it alone, it'll leave me alone too. I don't know. Maybe I'm just fooling myself. All I know is that something's out there, something big, and it's smart enough to know when someone's watching. I've been trying to convince myself that it was just some kind of bear, maybe even some guy in a suit playing a prank. But deep down I know that's not true. There's a feeling you get when you're face to face with a predator, a sense that you're not at the top of the food chain anymore. That's exactly how I felt that night, and it's something I can't forget. Anyway, I don't know if anyone else has ever experienced anything like this. I've read stories, seen posts online about people seeing things in the woods, but I always thought it was just talk. Now I'm not so sure. If you're reading this and you live out in the sticks like I do, just keep an eye on your animals. And if you hear them freaking out in the middle of the night, maybe think twice before running outside. Some things out here are better left alone. I know it might sound weird, and to be honest, I'm not sure if I'll ever really understand what happened to me that day. But I figured I'd share it here, since I've seen people talking about strange experiences in the woods, and maybe someone else has gone through something similar. It was back in 2002, on the Ruckle Creek Trail in Oregon. I was hiking alone, which, yeah, I know, not the smartest move. But I liked the solitude back then, being away from everything, just the quiet of the woods and the trail beneath my boots. I wasn't expecting anything other than a peaceful afternoon. It was a late afternoon, the kind where the sun's just starting to dip behind the treetops, and the shadows get a bit longer, making everything feel just a little more isolated. I'd been out there for hours, just meandering, not really in a rush to get anywhere. Then suddenly I heard it, a noise from the trees. It wasn't subtle. It was a heavy crashing sound, like something big was moving through the underbrush. Instinctively I thought bear, and froze. I mean, what else could it be, right? It wasn't a small rustle. It was like a whole tree was being shoved aside. I remember standing there holding my breath, scanning the thick growth around me. The noise kept getting closer, and my heart was pounding. But then I saw it. Something dark moving through the trees, heading up the hill to my right. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't moving like one either. It was running, almost in a hunched-over way, but fast, like way faster than I expected. My first thought, oddly enough, was that it looked like a gorilla, the broad back, the massive arms, the way it hunched forward. But it was taller, lankier, and definitely not supposed to be out here. I tried to pull my camera out, one of those old disposable ones. Yeah, remember those? My hands were shaking, and I fumbled with the damn thing, and by the time I managed to get it out, the creature was already disappearing behind this massive fallen log. I didn't even have time to focus. I snapped a picture in that direction anyway, but I knew I'd missed it. My heart was still racing, and for a second I thought about just getting the hell out of there. But curiosity got the better of me, and I crept up the trail a bit further, trying to see if I could spot it again. The air felt different, heavier almost, like the forest had gone quiet after that commotion. No birds, no wind, just this thick silence that made me feel like I was intruding on something I shouldn't be seeing. I kept looking, trying to convince myself that maybe it was just a trick of the light, or my mind playing games. Then, off in the distance, I noticed something. It was hard to make out, like a dark shape between the trees. It almost looked like a face, just barely visible through the branches. I raised my camera again, zooming in as best as that old thing could manage, and snapped another picture. I stood there for a minute, just staring at it, trying to figure out if what I was seeing was real or just some twisted-up tree stump. It felt like it was watching me back, which sounds ridiculous, I know, but that's the feeling I got. Like there were eyes, deep and hidden, just observing me. I didn't get closer. Something in my gut told me not to. I took a step back, then another, and eventually turned around and started heading back down the trail. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore, that whatever I'd seen was still there, just out of sight. When I finally made it back to my car, I was drenched in sweat, more from nerves than the hike itself. I sat there for a while, just trying to make sense of it. I even laughed at myself a bit, trying to brush it off as nothing more than my imagination. But when I got those photos developed, I swear that second one, the one with the face, it still creeps me out. It's blurry, obviously, and I can't say for sure what it is. Most people I've shown it to think it's just a knot in a tree or a shadow, but there's something about it that still makes the hair on my neck stand up. I ended up going back there twice after that, partly because I wanted answers, partly because I just couldn't let it go. Both times it was like nothing had ever happened. The trail was quiet, almost too normal, and I didn't hear or see anything out of the ordinary. No weird sounds, no glimpses of dark shapes moving through the trees. It was just calm. Almost like the forest had swallowed up whatever I'd seen and decided it wasn't going to show itself again. I've thought about it a lot over the years. I mean, I know how it sounds. I saw Bigfoot or whatever, but I'm not even sure if that's what it was. It felt more primal than that, like something ancient that didn't belong in this time or place. It's hard to explain, but the memory of it feels vivid, like it happened yesterday. I can still picture the way it moved, the muscles rippling under its dark fur, the sheer size of it. It wasn't just some guy in a suit, and it definitely wasn't a bear. Every now and then, I think about going back again, just to see if maybe I'll get another glimpse. But there's a part of me that's scared of what I might find, or worse, what I won't. The not knowing is what gets to me the most, I think. Like, did I really see what I thought I saw? Or was it just a trick of the mind, some weird combination of shadows and adrenaline? I guess I'll never really know. But one thing's for sure, I've never felt the same about hiking alone since then. I still hike, but there's always that nagging feeling in the back of my mind, especially when I'm deep in the woods and everything goes quiet. It's like I'm waiting for that sound again, that crashing in the underbrush that tells me I'm not alone. And honestly, part of me hopes I never hear it again. Because whatever it wasn't something I was meant to see. And I think the forest was just reminding me of that. I never thought I'd be here writing such an account, but after so many years of trying to ignore what happened, I think the time has come to share it. We're talking about the 1970s in Lake Quinault. My friend Mike and I used to love riding our motorcycles through the quarries there. We knew every shortcut, every curve. It was our favorite place to spend a few hours and forget about the world. Nothing much happened there, at least until that particular day. It was a Saturday afternoon. The sun was just starting to hide behind the trees, giving the sky an orange tinge, and I remember that the air was heavy, almost stuffy. We were walking slowly, enjoying the scenery and chatting. Suddenly Mike stopped abruptly, pointing to a clearing at the edge of the forest. Something was moving among the trees. At first, I thought it was a stray cow. It was big, thin, and covered in dark hair. It seemed to be coming out of the forest as if it was about to cross our path. But it was when the thing emerged fully from the shadows that I realized it wasn't a cow. The thing was huge. It must have been 2.5 meters long, and it was walking on 2 legs. Its hair was thick, brown, and covered its entire body. I stood frozen for a second, trying to process what I was seeing. Mike looked at me with an expression I had never seen on him before. Startled, incredulous, he only managed to let out a, "Dude, what the hell is that?" The creature was focused on 2 deer that were grazing up ahead. I swear, at that moment it looked like a scene from a documentary, you know? That giant beast took off running, and the deer shot off in the opposite direction as if their lives depended on it. The way the thing ran, it didn't look human, but it didn't look totally animal either. It was as if it had perfect coordination, each step long and precise. When the deer moved away, the creature stopped, as if it had lost interest. That's when I felt a chill run down my spine. It looked in our direction for a moment. I don't know if it really saw us or if it just noticed the movement of the motorcycles, but I could feel my neck beating. Mike was so still that I thought he had stopped breathing. The thing then turned around and went back into the forest, disappearing into the trees as if it had never been there. We didn't move for a good few minutes. The noise of the forest gradually returned, but my head was a complete blank. I didn't know what to think. I don't even know how long we stood there, just looking in the direction the thing had gone. Finally, Mike started the bike and gave me a look that said it all. "Let's get out of here." Without a word, we took the same route back, only this time every rustle in the undergrowth sounded like a warning. Every shadow was a threat. When we finally got home, we told Mike's father, hoping for some joke, some rational explanation that would make us laugh at ourselves. But he just gave us a serious look, took a deep drag on his cigarette and said, "You've probably seen a Sasquatch." I remember he said it in such a casual way that it gave me the creeps. It wasn't a joke. It was a real possibility. After that day, we avoided the quarry for a long time. I didn't talk about it much with Mike, but we both knew we didn't want to risk another encounter. However, that wasn't the only strange thing that happened in the area. A few weeks later, we were camping nearby and heard something walking heavily around our tent in the middle of the night. It wasn't a deer or a bear. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and heavy. We stood in silence, paralyzed, until it went away. Another time, we were returning home after an afternoon of fishing, and we heard a scream. It was a sound I'd never heard before, something between a roar and a wail, coming from the middle of the forest. The kind of sound that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up instantly. Mike's dad said it was just animals communicating, but there was something about that sound that seemed much more conscious. Since then, I haven't been able to look at that area in the same way. I remember how normal everything seemed, how those motorcycle rides were simply a way to relax and enjoy nature. Now, every time I go back there, and I admit there haven't been many since, I feel a weight, a sense that we're not as welcome as we thought. I'm not here to convince anyone that it was a Sasquatch. I still catch myself trying to rationalize it, thinking that maybe it was a bear or some kind of animal that I just didn't know about. But none of that makes sense when I remember the details, the way it walked, the way it seemed to understand what it was doing, the impossible height. It wasn't a hallucination. I was there, and so was Mike. I know that for many people this sounds ridiculous, something out of the horror stories we tell around the campfire. But for me, it was real. And that's the problem. When you see something you can't explain, something that doesn't fit in with anything you know, it marks you. You start to doubt reality, the things you've always taken for granted. To this day, I don't know what that really was. Life went on, I moved on, but every time I hear stories about Sasquatch, something turns in my stomach. It's as if, for a moment, I'm back in that quarry, with the sun going down, watching that creature disappear into the trees. The kind of thing you just can't forget. So that's it. Maybe it's not the most exciting story anyone's ever read here, but it's mine. And to this day, every time I see a dense forest, I can't help but wonder what might be hiding there, out of sight. Maybe I'll never know, but honestly, I prefer it that way. I've never been much of a storyteller, but after seeing a few people here sharing similar things, I thought it was worth sharing what happened to Mike and me that night in Satsop. That was in the 80s, and I still remember it as if it had happened yesterday. It was an early morning like any other. We were coming back from a baseball game that had ended late. You know how it is. It's a close game. Everyone stays up afterwards discussing the plays, laughing and so on. By the time we decided to leave, it was well after midnight. Satsop is a small town. Practically nothing happens there. And at that time, there wasn't even much street lighting. We were walking along the dirt road that ran through the woods, chatting about the game and laughing, when we started to hear a noise that honestly gave me a strange feeling. It was kind of a low sound, like heavy footsteps stepping on dry branches. But what alerted me was their regularity. It was no ordinary animal. It didn't sound like a deer or anything like that. At first, we just exchanged a look like, "Do you hear that too?" We tried to ignore it, but as we continued walking, it became clear that it was following us. With every step we took, there was that sound behind us, as if it was mirroring our movements. I'm not one to be easily frightened, but something was wrong. We tried to walk faster, and the footsteps quickened too, without running, but keeping pace with us. That's when Mike turned back and went pale. I didn't need to ask him what he was seeing. I knew there was something there, and it was getting closer. When I looked, my eyes adjusted to the dimness, and I saw that huge silhouette. Covered in grey fur, it was much bigger than anyone I had ever seen. It was at a distance where I could see the shape, but not the details of the face, and that was even more frightening. It was as if the thing was studying us, in no hurry at all, with no intention of hiding. The only thing we could think of was to run. Our hearts were pounding in our throats, and we didn't look back. We ran to Mrs. Thompson's house, a neighbor who lived nearby. I remember banging on the door like crazy, so hard I thought I was going to break the glass. Mike was next to me, looking back every second, and the look of terror on his face told me that the thing was still following us. Mrs. Thompson opened the door looking confused and scared, and we barely had time to explain. I just shouted something like, "There's something, let us in." She stepped out, looked where Mike was pointing, and I'll never forget the look on her face. She saw it. I know she saw it because she froze for a second and then pulled us inside in such a hurry that I almost tripped. She slammed the door, and I remember the sound of the lock being turned. We stood there, in her living room, panting, while she peered through the curtain at the window. "Oh my God," was all she managed to say. I plucked up the courage to look through the crack and saw the creature standing in the garden. It wasn't trying to get in or anything, it was just standing there, looking at the house. It was as if it knew we were looking back. After a few minutes, which seemed like an eternity, it turned around and started walking towards the river, which was further on. It didn't run, it didn't make any sudden movements. It simply walked away, in such a calm way that it almost made me doubt what I had seen. We were all silent, as if any sound could call it back. Mrs. Thompson just told us to stay there until dawn, and that's exactly what we did. The next day, after the sun had risen, we went out to see if there was any sign of what had happened. And there was. Huge footprints in the garden, marked in the soft earth. They looked human, but they were much bigger and wider, with well-defined toes. We followed the marks as far as the river, but then they disappeared into the water. I remember Mike trying to measure one of the footprints with his foot, and the difference was absurd. It was proof that it wasn't just our imagination. Some people in the neighborhood heard about what had happened, and there was even a small search of the area. They found some strange marks on the trees, as if something had passed through, but nothing that gave any concrete answers. The sheriff showed up, took a look, but in the end, there wasn't much they could do. They said it could have been a bear, but to this day, I know that wasn't it. You can't forget the way it watched us, as if it understood exactly what we were doing. Since then, I've never walked down that road at night again, and whenever I pass that way, even during the day, I still get a chill down my spine. I don't know what it was, and I may never know, but I can say with certainty that it wasn't just any animal, and that it wasn't something that belonged there. It's strange how something like that can change your perspective. No matter how much you try to explain it, I know what I saw, and I know that Mike and Mrs. Thompson saw it too. To this day, When I see her in town, we exchange a look that says it all, without us having to say a word. And maybe that's what scares me the most. The idea that somehow it's still out there, walking through the trees, watching, waiting, and that next time, maybe it won't be so patient. Whatever it is, I hope I never cross its path again.